Little Essays of Love and Virtue. Chapter 1. Children and Parents. The 20th century, as we know, has frequently been called the century of the child, when however we turn to the books of Ellen Key, who has most largely and sympathetically taken this point of view, one asks oneself whether after all the child's century has brought much to the child. Ellen Key points out with truth that even in our century parents may for the most part be divided into two classes: those who act as if their children existed only for their benefit, and those who act as if they existed only for their children's benefit. The results, she adds, being alike deplorable, for the first group of parents tyrannize over the child, seek to destroy its individuality, exercise an arbitrary discipline too spasmodic to have any of the good effects of discipline, and would model him into a copy of themselves, though really, she adds, it ought to pain them very much to see themselves exactly copied. The second group of parents may wish to model their children not after themselves, but after their ideals, yet they differ chiefly from the first class by their overindulgence, by their anxiety to pamper the child by yielding to all his caprices, and artificially protecting him from the natural results of those caprices, so that instead of learning freedom he has merely acquired self-will. These parents do not indeed tyrannize over their children, but they do worse: they train their children to be tyrants. Against these two tendencies of our century, Ellen Key declares her own alpha and omega of the art of education: try to leave the child in peace, live your own life, beautifully, nobly, temperately, and in so living you will sufficiently teach your children to live. It is not my purpose here to consider how far this conception of the duty of parents towards children is justified, and whether or not peace is the best preparation for a world in which struggle dominates. All these questions about education are rather idle. There are endless theories of education, but no agreement concerning the value of any of them, and the whole question of education remains open. I am here concerned less with the duty of parents in relation to their children than with the duty of children in relation to their parents, and that means that I am not concerned with young children to whom that duty still presents no serious problems, since they have not yet developed a personality with self-conscious individual needs. Certainly, the one attitude must condition the other attitude. The reaction of children against their parents is the necessary result of the parents' action, so that we have to pay some attention to the character of parental action. We cannot expect to find any coherent or uniform action on the part of parents, but there have been at different historical periods different general tendencies in the attitude of parents towards their children. Thus, if we go back 4 or 5 centuries in English social history, we seem to find a general attitude which scarcely corresponds exactly to either of Ellen Key's two groups. It seems usually to have been compounded of severity and independence. Children were first strictly compelled to go their parents' way, and then thrust off to their own way. There seems a certain hardness in this method, yet it is doubtful whether it can fairly be regarded as more unreasonable than either of the two modern methods deplored by Ellen Key. On the contrary, it had points for admiration. It was primarily a discipline, but it was regarded as any fortifying discipline should be regarded as a preparation for freedom, and it is precisely there that the more timid and clinging modern way seems to fail. We clearly see the old method at work in the chief source of knowledge concerning Old English domestic life. The Paston Letters. Here we find that at an early age, the sons of knights and gentlemen were sent to serve in the houses of other gentlemen. It was here that their education really took place, in education, not in book knowledge, but in knowledge of life. Such education was considered so necessary for a youth that a father who kept his sons at home was regarded as negligent of his duty to his family. A knowledge of the world was a necessary part, indeed the chief part of a youth's training for life. The remarkable thing is that this applied also to a large extent to the daughters. They realized in those days what is only beginning to be realized in ours: one, that after all, women live in the world just as much, though differently, as men live in the world, and that it is quite as necessary for the girl as for the boy to be trained to the meaning of life. Margaret Paston, towards the end of the 15th century, sent her daughter Anne to live in the house of a gentleman, who a little later found that he could not keep her, as he was purposing to decrease the size of his household. The mother writes to her son, I shall be fain to send for her, and with me she shall but lose her time, and without she be the better occupied she shall oftentimes move me, and put me to great unquietness. Remember what labor I had with your sister, therefore do your best to help her forth. As a result, it was planned to send her to a relative's house in London. It is evident that in the 15th century in England, there was a wide prevalence of this method of education, which in France a century later was still regarded as desirable by Montaigne. His reason for it is worth noting: children should be educated. Away from home, he remarks, in order to acquire hardness for the parents will be too tender to them. It is an opinion accepted by all that it is not right to bring up children in their parents' laps, for natural love softens and relaxes even the wisest too. In old France, indeed, the conditions seem similar to those in England. The great serio-comic novel of Anton de la Salle Petit-Jean de Sainter shows us in detail the education and the adventures, which certainly involved a very early introduction to life of a page, in a great house in the 15th century. We must not take everything in this fine comedy too solemnly. But in the 14th century book of the Knight of the Tour Landry, we may be sure that we have at its best the then prevailing view of the relation of a father to his tenderly loved daughters, of harshness and rigor in the relationship. It is not easy to find traces in this lengthy and elaborate book of paternal counsels, but it is clear that the father takes seriously the right of a daughter to govern herself and to decide for herself between right and wrong. It is his object, he tells his girls, to enable them to govern themselves in this task. He assumes that they are entitled to full knowledge, and we feel that he is not instructing them in the mysteries of that knowledge. He is taking for granted in the advice he gives and the stories he tells them that his young and small daughters, not poor things overburdened with experience, already possess the most precise knowledge of the intimate facts of life, and that he may tell them, without turning a hair, the most outrageous incidents of debauchery. Life already lies naked before them, that he assumes he is not imparting knowledge, he is giving good counsel. 3. It is clear that this kind of education and this attitude towards children must be regarded as the outcome of the whole medieval method of life, in a state of society where roughness and violence, though not, as we sometimes assume, chronic, were yet always liable to be manifested. It was necessary for every man and woman to be able to face the crudest facts of the world, and to be able to maintain his or her own rights against them. The education that best secured that strength and independence was the best education, and it necessarily involved an element of hardness. We must go back earlier than Montaigne's day, when the conditions were becoming mitigated, to see the system working in all its vigor. The lady of the day of the early 13th century has been well described by Luchaire in his scholarly study of French society in the time of Philip Augustus. She was, he tells us, as indeed she had been in the preceding feudal centuries, often what we should nowadays call a virago of violent temperament, with vivid passions broken in from childhood to all physical exercises, sharing the pleasures and dangers of the nights around her feudal life, fertile in surprises and in risks demanded even women, a vigorous temper of soul and body, a masculine air and habits also that were almost virile. She accompanied her father or her husband to the chase while in wartime, if she became a widow, or if her husband was away at the Crusades. She was ready, if necessary, to direct the defenses of the lordship, and in peacetime she was not afraid of the longest and most dangerous pilgrimages. She might even go to the Crusades on her own account, and if circumstances required, conduct a war to come out victoriously. We may imagine the robust kind of education required to produce people of this quality, but as regards the precise way in which parents conducted that education, we have, as Luchaire admits, little precise knowledge. It is for the most part only indirectly, by reading between the lines, that we glean something as to what it was considered befitting to inculcate in a good household, and as what we thus learn is mostly from the writings of churchmen, it is doubtless a little one-sided. Thus Adam de Persigny, an ecclesiastic, writes to the Countess du Perche to advise her how to live in a Christian manner. He counsels her to abstain from playing games of chance and chess, not to take pleasure in the indecent farces of actors, and to be moderate in dress. Then, as ever, preachers expressed their horror of the ruinous extravagance of women, their false hair, their rouge, and their dresses that were too long or too short. They also reprobated their love of flirtation. It was, however, in those days, a young girl's recognized duty, when a knight arrived in the household, to exercise the rites of hospitality, to disarm him, give him his bath, and if necessary massage him to help him to go to sleep. It is not surprising that the young girl sometimes made love to the knight under these circumstances, nor is it surprising that he, engaged in an arduous life and trained to disdain feminine attractions, often failed to respond. It is easy to understand how this state of things gradually became transformed into the considerably different position of parents and child we have known, which doubtless attained its climax nearly a century ago. Feudal conditions with the large households so well adapted to act as seminaries for youth began to decay, and as education in such seminaries must have led to frequent mischances, both for youths and maidens, who enjoyed the opportunities of education there, the regret for their disappearance may often have been tempered. For parents, schools, colleges, and universities began to spring up and develop for one sex, while for the other home life grew more intimate, and domestic ties, closer. Montaigne's warning against the undue tenderness of a narrow family life no longer seemed reasonable, and the family became more self-centered and more enclosed beneath this. And more profoundly influential, there was a general softening in social respects, and a greater expansiveness of affectional relationships in reality, or in seeming within the home. Compensating it may be the more diffused social feeling within a group, which characterized the previous period. So was cultivated that undue tenderness deplored by Montaigne, which we now regard as almost normal in family life, and solemnly label, if we happen to be psychoanalysts, the Oedipus complex, or the Electra complex. Sexual love is closely related to parental love. The tender emotion, which is an intimate part of parental love, is also an intimate part of sexual love, and two emotions which are each closely related to a third emotion cannot fail to become often closely associated to each other. With a little thought we might guess beforehand, even while still in complete ignorance of the matter, that there could not fail to be frequently a sexual tinge in the affection of a father for his daughter, of a mother for her son, of a son for his mother, or a daughter for her father. Needless to say, that does not mean that there is present any physical desire of sex in the narrow sense. That would be a perversity, and a rare perversity. We are here on another plane than that of crude physical desire, and are moving within the sphere of the emotions. But such emotions are often strong, and all the stronger because conscious of their own absolute rectitude, and often masked under the shape of duty. Yet, when prolonged beyond the age of childhood, they tend to become a clog on development, and a hindrance to a wholesome life. The child who cherishes such emotion is likely to suffer infantile arrest of development, and the parent who is so selfish as to continue to expend such tenderness on a child who has passed the age of childhood, or to demand it, is guilty of a serious offense against that child. That the intimate family life which sometimes resulted, especially when, as frequently happened, the seeming mutual devotion was also real, might often be regarded as beautiful and almost ideal, it has been customary to repeat with an emphasis that in the end has even become nauseous, for it was usually overlooked that the self-centered and enclosed family, even when the mutual affection of its members was real enough to bear all examination, could scarcely be more than partially beautiful, and could never be ideal. For the family only represents one aspect, however important an aspect of a human being's functions and activities. He cannot, she cannot be divorced from the life of the social group, and a life is beautiful and ideal, or the reverse, only when we have taken into our consideration the social as well as the family relationship. When the family claims to prevent the free association of an adult member of it with the larger social organization, it is claiming that the part is greater than the whole, and such a claim cannot fail to be morbid and mischievous. The old-world method of treating children, we know, has long ago been displaced as containing an element of harsh tyranny, but it was not perceived, and it seems indeed not even yet to be generally recognized, that the system which replaced it, and is only now beginning to pass away, involved another and more subtle tyranny, the more potent, because not seemingly harsh. Parents no longer whipped their children even when grown up, or put them in seclusion, or exercised physical force upon them after they had passed childhood. They felt that that would not be in harmony with the social customs of a world in which ancient feudal notions were dead. But they merely replaced the external compulsion by an internal compulsion, which was much more effective. It was based on the moral assumption of claims and duties which were rarely formulated, because parents found it quite easy and pleasant to avoid formulating them, and children, on the rare occasions when they formulated them, usually felt a sense of guilt in challenging their validity. It was in the 19th century that this state of things reached its full development. The sons of the family were usually able, as they grew up, to escape and elude it, although they thereby often created an undesirable divorce from the home, and often suffered as well as inflicted much pain in tearing themselves loose from the spiritual bonds, especially perhaps in matters of religion woven by long tradition to bind them to their parents. It was on the daughters that the chief stress fell. For the working class, Indeed, there was often the possibility of escape into hard labor, if only that of marriage, but such escape was not possible immediately, or at all for a large number during the 19th century. Many had been so carefully enclosed in invisible cages, they had been so well drilled in the reticences, and the duties, and the subserviences that their parents silently demanded of them, that we can never know all the tragedies that took place in exceptional cases. Indeed, they gave a sign when they possessed unusual power of intellect or unusual power of character. And will they succeeded in breaking loose from their cages, or at least in giving expression to themselves? This is seen in the stories of nearly all the women eminent in life and literature during the 19th century, from the days of Mary Wollstonecraft onwards. The bronze almost yet not quite strangled by the fetters placed upon them by their stern and narrow-minded father, and enabled to attain the full stature of their genius only by that brief sojourn in Brussels, our representative Elizabeth Barrett, chained to a couch of invalidism under the eyes of an imperiously affectionate father, until with Robert Browning's aid she secretly eloped into the open air of freedom and health, and so attained complete literary expression, is a typical figure. It is only because we recognize that she is a typical figure among the women who attain distinction that we are able to guess at the vast number of mute inglorious Elizabeth Barretts, who were never able to escape by their own efforts, and never found a Browning to aid them to escape. It is sometimes said that those days are long past, and that young women in all the countries which we are pleased to call civilized are now emancipated. Indeed, rather too much emancipated critics come forward to complain of their undue freedom, of their irreverent familiarity to their parents, of their language, of their habits. But there were critics who said the very same things in almost the same words of the grandmothers of these girls. These incompetent critics are as ignorant of the social history of the past as they are of the social significance of the history of the present. We read, in Once a Week of 60 years ago, 10th August 1861, the very period when the domestic conditions of girls were the most oppressive in the sense here understood, that these same critics were about at that time, and as shocked as they are now at the young ladies who talk of awful swells and deuced bores, who smoke and venture upon free discourse, and try to be like men. The writer of this anonymous article, who was really, I judge from internal evidence, so distinguished and so serious a woman as Harriet Martineau, duly snubs these critics, pointing out that such accusations are at least as old as Addison and Horace Walpole. She remarks that there have no doubt been so-called fast young ladies in every age, varying their doings and sayings according to the fopperies of the time. The question, as she pertinently concludes, is, as indeed it still remains today, have we more than the average proportion? I do not know, nor today do we know. But while today as ever before we have a certain proportion of these emancipated girls, and while today as perhaps never before we are able to understand that they have an element of reason on their side, it would be a mistake to suppose that they are more than exceptions. The majority are unable and not even anxious to attain this light-hearted social emancipation. For the majority, even though they are workers, the anciently subtle ties of the home are still as they should be, an element of natural piety, and also as they should not be clinging fetters, which impede individuality and destroy personal initiative. We all know so many happy homes beneath whose calm surface this process is working out. The parents are deeply attached to their children, who still remain children to them. Even when they are grown up, they wish to guide them and mold them, and cherish them, to protect them from the world, to enjoy their society and their aid, and they expect that their children shall continue indefinitely to remain children. The children on their side remain, and always will remain, tenderly attached to their parents, and it would really pain them to feel that they are harboring any unwillingness to stay in the home, even after they have grown up, so long as their parents need their attention. It is of course the daughters who are thus expected to remain in the home, and who feel this compunction about leaving it. It seems to use, although, as we have seen, so unlike the attitude of former days, a natural, beautiful, and rightful feeling on both sides. Yet in the result, all sorts of evils tend to ensue. The parents often take as their moral right the services which should only be accepted, if accepted at all, as the offering of love and gratitude, and even reach a degree of domineering selfishness, in which they refuse to believe that their children have any adult rights of their own, absorbing and drying up that physical and spiritual lifeblood of their offspring, which it is the parents' part in nature to feed. If the children are willing, there is nothing to mitigate this process. If they are unwilling, the result is often a disastrous conflict. Their time and energy are not their own, their tastes are criticized, and so far as possible crushed. Their political ideas, if they have any, are treated as pernicious, and which is often on both sides, the most painful of all differences in religious belief, lead to bitter controversy and humiliating recrimination. Such differences in outlook between youth and age are natural and inevitable, and right the parents themselves, though they may have forgotten. It often in youth similarly revolted against the cherished doctrines of their own parents. It has ever been, so the only difference being that today probably the opportunities for variation are greater, so it comes about that what James Hinton said half a century ago is often true today. Our happy Christian homes are the real dark places of the earth. It is evident that the problem of the relation of the child to the parent is still incompletely solved, even in what we consider our highest civilization. There is here needed an art, in which those who have to exercise it can scarcely possess all the necessary skill and experience among trees and birds and beasts. The art is surer, because it is exercised unconsciously on the foundation of a large tradition, in which failure meant death in the common, procreative profusion of those forms of life. The frequent death of the young was a matter of little concern. But biologically, there was never any sacrifice of the offspring to the well-being of the parents. Whenever sacrifice is called for, it is the parents who are sacrificed to their offspring in our superior human civilization, in which quantity ever tends to give place to quality. The higher value of the individual involves an effort to avoid sacrifice, which sometimes proves worse than abortive. An avian philosopher would be unlikely to feel called upon to denounce nests as the dark places of the earth. And in laying down our human moral laws, we have always to be aware of forgetting the fundamental biological relationship of parent and child, to which all such moral laws must conform. To some would parents that necessity may seem hard in such a case, it is well for them to remember that there is no need to become parents, and that we live in an age when it is not difficult to avoid becoming a parent. The world is not dying for lack of parents. On the contrary, we have far too many of them: ignorant parents, silly parents, unwilling parents, undesirable parents, and those who aspire to the high dignity of creating the future race. Let them be as few as they will, and perhaps at the present time, the fewer the better. Must not refuse the responsibilities of that position, its pains, as well as its joys. In our human world, as we know, the moral duties laid upon us, duties in which if we fail we become outcasts in our own eyes or in those of others, or in both, are of three kinds: the duties to oneself, the duties to the small circle of those we love, and the duties to the larger circle of mankind, to which ultimately we belong, since out of it we proceed, and to it we owe all that we are. There are no maxims, there is only an art, and a difficult art, to harmonize duties, which must often conflict. We have to be true to all the motives that sanctify our lives. To that extent, George Eliot's Maggie Tulliver was undoubtedly right, but the renunciation of the self is not the routine solution of every conflict any more than is the absolute failure to renounce. In a certain sense, the duty towards the self comes before all others, because it is the condition on which duties towards others possess any significance and worth. In that sense, it is true, according to the familiar saying of Shakespeare, though it was only Polonius, the man of maxims, who voiced it, that one cannot be true to others unless one is first true to oneself, and that one can know nothing of giving aught that is worthy to give unless one also knows how to take. We see that the problem of the place of parents in life after their function of parenthood has been adequately fulfilled. A problem, which offers no difficulties among most forms of life, has been found hard to solve by man. At some places and periods, it has been considered most merciful to put them to death. At others, they have been almost or quite deified and allowed to regulate the whole lives of their descendants. Thus in New Caledonia, aged parents, it is said by Mrs. Hadfield, were formerly taken up to a high mountain and left with enough food to last a few days. There was at the same time great regard for the aged, as also among the Hottentots, who asked, "Can you see a parent or a relative shaking and freezing under a cold, dreary, heavy, useless old age, and not think in pity of them of putting an end to their misery?" It was generally the opinion of the parents themselves. But in some countries, the parents have dominated and overawed their children to the time of their natural death, and even beyond, up to the point of ancestor worship, as in China, where no man of any age can act for himself in the chief matters of life during his parents' lifetime, and to some extent in ancient Rome, whence an influence in this direction, which still exists in the laws and customs of France. 4. Both extremes have proved compatible with a beautifully human life. To steer midway between them seems today, however, the wisest course. There ought to be no reason, and under happy conditions, there is no reason why the relationship between parent and child, as one of mutual affection and care, should ever cease to exist, but that the relationship should continue to exist as a tie is unnatural and tends to be harmful at a certain stage in the development of the child. The physical tie with the parent is severed, and the umbilical cord cut at a later stage in development when puberty is attained, and adolescence is feeling its way towards a complete adult maturity. The spiritual tie must be severed. It is absolutely essential that the young spirit should begin to essay its own wings. If its energy is not equal to this adventure, then it is the part of a truly loving parent to push it over the edge of the nest. Of course, there are dangers and risks, but the worst dangers and risks come of the failure to adventure, of the refusal to face the tasks of the world, and to assume the full function of life. All that Freud has told of the paralyzing and maiming influence of infantile arrest or regression is here profitable to consider, in order, moreover, that the relationship between parents and children may retain its early beauty and love. It is essential that it shall adapt itself to adult conditions, and the absence of ties so rendered necessary. Otherwise, there is little likelihood of anything but friction and pain on one side or the other, and perhaps on both sides. So it is that the problem of the attitude of the child to its parents circles round again to that of the parents to the child. The wise parent realizes that childhood is simply a preparation for the free activities of later life, that the parents exist in order to equip children for life, and not to shelter and protect them from the world into which they must be cast. Education, whatever else it should or should not be, must be an inoculation against the poisons of life, and an adequate equipment in knowledge and skill for meeting the chances of life beyond that, and no doubt in the largest part it is a natural growth, and takes place of itself. Chapter 2. The meaning of purity. We live in a world in which, as we nowadays begin to realize, we find two antagonistic streams of traditional platitude concerning the question of sexual purity, both flowing from the far past. The people who embody one of these streams of tradition, basing themselves on old-fashioned physiology, assume, though they may not always assert, that the sexual products are excretions to be dealt with summarily like other excretions. That is an ancient view, and it was accepted by such wise philosophers of old times as Montaigne and Sir Thomas More. It had moreover the hearty support of so eminent a theological authority as Luther, who on this ground preached early marriage to men and women alike. It is still a popular view, sometimes expressed in the crudest terms, and often by people who, not following Luther's example, use it to defend prostitution, though they generally exclude women from its operation as a sex to whom it fails to apply, and by whom it is not required. But on the other hand, we have another stream of platitude on this side. There is usually little attempt either to deny or to affirm the theory of the opposing party, though they would contradict its conclusions. Their theory, if they have one, would usually seem to be that sexual activity is a response to stimulation from without or from within, so that if there is no stimulation, there will be no sexual manifestation. They would preach, they tell us, a strenuous ideal. They would set up a wholesome dictate of hygiene. The formula put forward on this basis usually runs: continence is not only harmless but beneficial. It is a formula which in one form or another has received apparently enthusiastic approval in many quarters, even from distinguished physicians. We need not be surprised a proposition so large and general is not easy to deny, and is still more difficult to reverse. Therefore, it proves welcome to the people, especially the people occupying public and professional positions who wish to find the path of least resistance under pressure of a vigorous section of public opinion. Yet in its vagueness, the proposition is a little disingenuous. It condescends to no definitions and no qualifications. It fails even to make clear how it is to be reconciled with any enthusiastic approval of marriage. For if continence is beautiful, how can marriage make it cease to be so? Both these streams of feeling, it may be noted, sprang from a common source far back in the primitive human world. All the emanations of the human body, all the spontaneous manifestations of its activities, were mysterious and ominous to early man, pregnant with terror, unless met with immense precautions, and surrounded by careful ritual. The manifestations of sex were the least intelligible, and the most spontaneous. Therefore, the things of sex were those that most lent themselves to feelings of horror and awe, of impurity and of purity. They seemed so highly charged with magic potency that there were no things that men more sought to avoid, yet none to which they were impelled to give more thought. The manifold echoes of that primitive conception of sex, and all the violent reactions that were thus evolved and eventually bound up with the original impulse, compose the streams of tradition that feed our modern world in this matter and determine the ideas of purity that surround us. At the present day, the crude theory of the sexual impulse held on one side and the ignorant rejection of theory altogether on the other side are beginning to be seen as both alike unjustified. We begin to find the grounds for a sounder theory, not indeed that the problems of sex, which go so deeply into the whole personal and social life, can ever be settled exclusively upon physiological grounds, but we have done much to prepare even the loftiest building of love when we have attained a clear view of its biological basis. The progress of chemico-physiological research during recent years has now brought us to new ground for our building. Indeed, the image might well be changed altogether, and it might be said that science has entirely transferred the drama of reproduction to a new stage with new actors. Therewith, the immense emphasis placed on excretion and the inevitable reaction that emphasis aroused both alike disappear. The sexual protagonists are no longer at the surface, but within the most secret recesses of the organism, and they appear to science under the name of hormones, or internal secretions, always at work within, and never themselves condescending to appear at all. Those products of the sexual glands, which in both sexes are cast out of the body, and at an immature stage of knowledge appeared to be excretions, are of primary reproductive importance. But as regards the sexual constitution of the individual, they are of far less importance than the internal secretions of these very same glands. It is, however, by no means only the specifically sexual glands which thus exert a sexual influence within the organism. Other glands in the brain, the throat, and the abdomen, such as the thyroid and the adrenal sphere, also elaborating fermentative secretions to throw into the system. Their mutual play is so elaborate that it is only beginning to be understood. Some internal secretions stimulate, others inhibit, and the same secretions may, under different conditions, do either. This fact is the source of many degrees and varieties of energy and formative power in the organism. Taken altogether, the internal secretions are the forces which build up the man's and woman's distinctively sexual constitution, the special disposition and growth of hair, the relative development of breasts and pelvis, the characteristic differences in motor activity, the varying emotional desires and needs. It is in the complex play of these secretions that we now seek the explanation of all the peculiarities of sexual constitution, imperfect or one-sided physical and psychic development, the various approximations of the male to female bodily and emotional disposition of the female to the male, all the numerous gradations that occur naturally, as we now see, between the complete man and the complete woman. When we turn the light of this new conception on to our old ideas of puritito, the virtue, or the vice accordingly, as we may have been pleased to consider it, of sexual abstinence, you begin to see that those ideas need radical revision. They appear in a new light. Their whole meaning is changed, no doubt. It may be said they never had the validity they appeared to possess, even when we judge them by the crudest criterion, that of practice. Thus, while it is the rule for physicians to proclaim the advantages of sexual continence, there is no good reason to believe that they have themselves practiced it in any eminent degree. A few years ago, an inquiry among 35 distinguished physicians, chiefly German and Russian, showed that they were nearly all of opinion that continence is harmless, if not beneficial, but Merowski found by inquiry of 86 physicians of much the same nationalities that only one had himself been sexually abstinent before marriage. There seem to be no similar statistics for the English-speaking countries, where there exists a greater modestith, not perhaps notably less need for it in the making of such confessions. But if we turn to the allied profession, which is strongly on the side of sexual abstinence, we find that, among theological students, as has been shown in the United States, while prostitution may be infrequent, no temptation is so frequent or so potent, and in most cases so irresistible as that to solitary sexual indulgence. Such is the actual attitude towards the two least ideal forms of sexual practicias, distinguished from mere therion, the part of the two professions which most definitely pronounce in favor of continence. It is necessary, however, as will now be clearer to set our net more widely, we must take into consideration every form and degree of sexual manifestation, normal and abnormal, gross and ethereal. When we do this even cautiously, and without going far afield, sexual abstinence is found to be singularly elusive. Rolder, careful and conscientious investigator, has asserted that such abstinence in the true and complete sense is absolutely non-existent. The genuine cases in which sexual phenomena of some kind or other fail to manifest themselves, being simply cases of inborn lack of sexual sensibility, he met indeed a few people who seemed exceptions to the general rule, but on better knowledge he found that he was mistaken, and that so far from being absent in these people, the sexual instinct was present even in its crudest shapes. The activity of sex is an activity that on the physical side is generated by the complex mechanism of the ductless glands, and displayed in the whole organism, physical and psychic, of the individual, who cannot abolish that activity, although to some extent able to regulate the forms in which it is manifested, so that purity cannot be the abolition, or even the indefinite suspension of sexual manifestations. It must be the wise and beautiful control of them. It is becoming clear that the old platitudes can no longer be maintained, and that if we wish to improve our morals, we must first improve our knowledge. Roman 2. We have seen that various popular beliefs and conventional assumptions concerning the sexual impulse can no longer be maintained. The sexual activities of the organism are not mere responses to stimulation, absent if we choose to apply no stimulus, never troubling us if we run away from them, harmless if we enclose them within a high wall, nor do they constitute a mere excretion, or a mere appetite, which we can control by a crude system of hygiene and dietetics. We better understand the psychosexual constitution if we regard the motive power behind it as a dynamic energy, produced and maintained by a complex mechanism at certain inner foci of the body, and realize that whatever periodic explosive manifestations may take place at the surface, the primary motive source lies in the intimate recesses of the organism, while the outcome is the whole physical and spiritual energy of our being under those aspects which are most forcible and most aspiring, and even most ethereal. This conception, we find, is now receiving an admirable and beautifully adequate physical basis in the researches of distinguished physiologists in various lands concerning the parts played by the ductless glands of the body in sensitive equilibrium with each other, pouring out into the system, stimulating and inhibiting hormones, which not only confer on the man's or woman's body those specific sexual characters which we admire, but at the same time impart the special tone and fiber and polarity of masculinity or femininity to the psychic disposition. Yet even before Brown-Séquard's first epoch-making suggestion had set physiologists to search for internal secretions, the insight of certain physicians on the medico-psychological side was independently leading towards the same dynamic conception. In the middle of the last century, Anstey, an acute London physician, more or less vaguely realized the transformations of sexual energy into nervous disease and into artistic energy. James Hinton, whose genius rendered him the precursor of many modern ideas, had definitely grasped the dynamic nature of sexual activity and daringly proposed to utilize it not only as a solution of the difficulties of the personal life, but for the revolutionary transformation of morality. 5. It was the wish to group together all the far-flung manifestations of the inner irresistible process of sexual activity that underlay my own conception of autoerotism, or the spontaneous erotic impulse, which arises from the organism apart from all definite external stimulation, to be manifested, or it may be transformed in mere solitary physical sex activity in dreams of the night, in daydreams, in shapes of literature and art, in symptoms of nervous disorder, such as some forms of hysteria, and even in the most exalted phases of mystical devotion. Since then, a more elaborate attempt to develop a similar dynamic conception of sexual activity has been made by Freud, and the psychoanalysts who have followed him, or sometimes diverged, have with endless subtlety and courageous thoroughness traced the long and sinuous paths of sexual energy in personality, and in life, indeed in all the main manifestations of human activity. It is important for us to note about this dynamic sexual energy in the constitution that while it is very firmly and organically rooted and quite indestructible, it assumes very various shapes on the physical side, all the characters of sexual distinction, and all the beauties of sexual adornment are wrought by the power furnished by the cooperating furnaces of the glands, and so also on the psychic side are emotions and impulses, which range from the simplest longings for sensual contact to the most exalted rapture of union with the infinite. Moreover, there is a certain degree of correlation between the physical and the psychic manifestation of sexual energy, and to some extent transformation is possible in the embodiment of that energy. A vague belief in the transformation of sexual energy has long been widespread. It is apparently shown in the idea that continence as an economy in the expenditure of sexual force may be practiced to aid the physical and mental development, while folklore reveals various sayings in regard to the supposed influence of sexual abstinence in the causation of insanity. There is a certain underlying basis of reason in such beliefs, though in an unqualified form, they cannot be accepted, for they take no account of the complexity of the factors involved, of the difficulty and often impossibility of effecting any complete transformation either in a desirable or undesirable direction, and of the serious conflict which the process often involves. The psychoanalysts have helped us here. Whether or not we accept their elaborate and often shifting conceptions, they have emphasized and developed a psychological conception of sexual energy and its transformations before only vaguely apprehended, which is now seen to harmonize with the modern physiological view. The old notion that sexual activity is merely a matter of the voluntary exercise or abstinence from exercise of the reproductive functions of adult persons has too long obstructed any clear vision of the fact that sexuality in the wide and deep sense is independent of the developments of puberty. This has long been accepted as an occasional and therefore abnormal fact, but we have to recognize that it is true almost or quite normally even of early childhood. No doubt, we must here extend the word sexuality in what may well be considered an illegitimate way to cover manifestations which in the usual sense are not sexual or are at most called sexual perversions, but this extension has a certain justification in view of the fact that these manifestations can be seen to be definitely related to the ordinary adult forms of sexuality. However we define it, we have to recognize that the child takes the same kind of pleasure in those functions which are natural to his age as the adult is capable of taking in localized sexual functions, that he may weave ideas around such functions, sometimes cultivate their exercise from love of luxury, make them the basis of daydreams which at puberty, when the ideals of adult life are ready to capture his sexual energy, he begins to grow ashamed of. At this stage, indeed, we reach a crucial point, though it has usually been overlooked in the lives of boys and girls, more especially those whose heredity may have been a little tainted, or their upbringing a little twisted. For it is here that the transformation of energy and the resulting possibilities of conflict are wont to enter in the harmoniously developing organism. One may say there is at this period a gradual and easy transmutation of the childish pleasurable activities into adult activities, accompanied perhaps by a feeling of shame for the earlier feelings, though this quickly passes into a forgetfulness, which often leads the adult far astray when he attempts to understand the psychic life of the child. The childish manifestations, it must be remarked, are not necessarily unwholesome. They probably perform a valuable function and develop budding sexual emotions, just as the petals of flowers are developed in pale and contorted shapes beneath the enveloping sheaths. But in our human life, the transmutation is often not so easy as in flowers. Normally, indeed, the adolescent transformations of sex are so urgent and so manifold. No definite sensual desire, now muscular impulses of adventure, now emotional aspirations in the sphere of art or religion, that they easily overwhelm and absorb all its vaguer and more twisted manifestations in childhood. Yet it may happen that by some aberration of internal development or of external influence, this conversion of energy may at one point or another fail to be completely effected. Then some fragment of infantile sexuality survives in rare cases to turn all the adult faculties to its service, and become reckless and triumphant in minor and more frequent cases to be subordinated and more or less repressed into the subconscious sphere by voluntary or even involuntary and unconscious effort. Then we may have conflict which, when it works, happily, exerts a fortifying and ennobling influence on character, when more unhappily a disturbing influence, which may even lead to conditions of definite nervous disorder. The process by which this fundamental sexual energy is elevated from elementary and primitive forms into complex and developed forms, is termed sublimation, a term originally used for the process of raising by heat a solid substance to the state of vapor, which was applied even by such early writers as Drayton and Davies in a metaphorical and spiritual sense. 7. In the sexual sphere, sublimation is of vital importance because it comes into question throughout the whole of life, and our relation to it must intimately affect our conception of morality, the element of athletic asceticism, which is a part of all virility and is found even indeed often in a high degree among savages, has its main moral justification as one aid to sublimation throughout life. Sublimation acts by transforming some part at all events of the creative sexual energy from its elementary animal manifestations into more highly individual and social manifestations, or at all events into finer forms of sexual activity, forms that seem to us more beautiful and satisfy us more widely. Purity, we thus come to see, is in one aspect the action of sublimation not abolishing sexual activity, but lifting it into forms of which our best judgment may approve. We must not suppose, as is too often assumed, that sublimation can be carried out easily, completely, or even with unmixed advantage. If it were so, certainly the old-fashioned moralist would be confronted by few difficulties. But we have ample reason to believe that it is not so. It is with sexual energy, well observes Freud, who yet attaches great importance to sublimation, as it is with heat in our machines. Only a certain proportion can be transformed into work, or as it is put by Lowenfeld, who is not a constructive philosopher, but a careful and cautious medical investigator. The advantages of sublimation are not received in specially high degree by those who permanently deny to their sexual impulse every natural direct relief. The celibate Catholic clergy, notwithstanding their heroic achievements in individual cases, can scarcely be said to display a conspicuous excess of intellectual energy on the whole over the non-celibate Protestant clergy, or if we compare the English clergy before and after the Protestant Reformation. Though the earlier period may reveal more daring and brilliant personages, the whole intellectual output of the later church may claim comparison with that of the earlier church. There are clearly other factors at work besides sublimation, and even sublimation may act most potently not when the sexual activities sink or are driven into a tame and monotonous subordination, but rather when they assume a splendid energy which surges into many channels. Yet sublimation is a very real influence, not only in its more unconscious and profound operations, but in its more immediate and temporary applications, as part of an athletic discipline, acting best perhaps when it acts most automatically to utilize the motor energy of the organism in the attainment of any high physical or psychic achievement. We have to realize, however, that these transmutations do not only take place by way of a sublimation of sexual energy, but also by way of a degradation of that energy. The new form of energy produced, that is to say, may not be of a beneficial kind, it may be of a mischievous kind, a form of perversion or disease. Sexual self-denial, instead of leading to sublimation, may lead to nervous disorder, when the erotic tension failing to find a natural outlet, and not sublimated to higher erotic or non-erotic ends in the real world, is transmuted into an unreal dreamland, thus undergoing what Jung terms introversion, while there are also the people already referred to, in whom immature childish sexuality persists into an adult stage of development. It is no longer altogether in accord with, so that conflict with various possible trains of nervous symptoms may result disturbances and conflicts in the emotional sexual field. May we know in these and similar ways become transformed into physical symptoms of disorder, which can be seen to have a precise symbolic relationship to definite events in the patient's emotional history, while fits of nervous terror or anxiety neurosis may frequently be regarded as a degradation of thwarted or disturbed sexual energy, manifesting its origin by presenting a picture of sexual excitation transposed into a non-sexual shape of an entirely useless or mischievous character. Thus, to sum up, we may say that the sexual energy of the organism is a mighty force automatically generated throughout life under healthy conditions. That force is transmuted in more or less degree, but never entirely, into forms that further the development of the individual and the general ends of life. These transformations are to some extent automatic, to some extent within the control of personal guidance, but there are limits to such guidance, for the primitive human personality can never be altogether rendered an artificial creature of civilization. When these limits are reached, the transmutation of sexual energy may become useless or even dangerous, and we fail to attain the exquisite flower of purity. Romans 3. It may seem that in setting forth the nature of the sexual impulse in the light of modern biology and psychology, I have said but little of purity, and less of morality. Yet that is as it should be. We must first be content to see how the machine works, and watch the wheels go round. We must understand before we can pretend to control in the natural world, as Bacon long ago said, we can only command by obeying. Moreover, in this field nature's order is far older and more firmly established than our civilized human morality. In our arrogance, we often assume that morality is the master of nature, yet except when it is so elementary or fundamental as to be part of nature, it is but a guide, and a guide that is only a child so young, so capricious, that in every age its wayward hand has sought to pull nature in a different direction. Even only in order to guide, we must first see and know. We realize that never more than when we observe the distinction which conventional sex morals so often makes between men and women, failing to find in women exactly the same kind of sexual emotions as they find in themselves. Men have concluded that there are none there at all, so man has regarded himself as the sexual animal and woman as either the passive object of adoring love or the helpless victim of his degrading lust. In either case, as a being who, unlike man, possessed an innocent purity by nature, without any need for the trouble of acquiring it of woman, as a real human being with sexual needs and sexual responsibilities, morality has often known nothing. It has been content to preach restraint to man, an abstract and meaningless restraint, even if it were possible. But when we have regard to the actual facts of life, we can no longer place virtue in a vacuum. Women are just as apt as men to be afflicted by the petty jealousies and narrownesses of the crude sexual impulse. Women, just as much as men, need the perpetual sublimation of erotic desire into forms of more sincere purity, of larger harmony, in gaining which ends all the essential ends of morality are alone gained: the delicate adjustment of the needs of each sex to the needs of the other sex, to the end of what Chaucer called fine loving. The adjustment of the needs of both sexes to the larger ends of fine living may well furnish a perpetual moral discipline, which extends its fortifying influence to men and women alike. It is this universality of sexual emotion, blending in its own mighty stream, as is now realized many other currents of emotion, even the parental and the filial and traceable, even in childhood, wide efflorescence of an energy constantly generated by a vital internal mechanism which renders vain all attempts either to suppress or to ignore the problem of sex. However immensely urgent, we might foolishly imagine such attempts to be. Even the history of the early Christian ascetics in Egypt, as recorded in the contemporary Paradise of Palladius, illustrates the futility of seeking to quench the unquenchable, the flame of fire which is life itself. These athletes of the Lord were under the best possible conditions for the conquest of lust. They had been driven into the solitude of the desert. By a genuine deep-lifeful impulse, they could regulate their lives as they would, and they possessed an almost inconceivable energy of resolution. They were prepared to live on herbs, even to eat grass, and to undertake any labor of self-denial. They were so scrupulous that we hear of a holy man who would even efface a woman's footprints in the sand, lest a brother might thereby be led into thoughts of evil. Yet they were perpetually tempted to seductive visions and desires, even after a monastic life of 40 years, and the women seem to have been not less liable to yield to temptation than the men. It may be noted that in the most perfect saints, there has not always been a complete suppression of the sexual impulse, even on the normal plane, nor even in some cases the attempt at such complete suppression. In the early days of Christianity, the exercise of chastity was frequently combined with a close and romantic intimacy of affection between the sexes which shocked austere moralists. Even in the 11th century, we find that the charming and saintly Robert of Arborsel, founder of the Order of Fontevrault, would often sleep with his nuns, notwithstanding the remonstrances of pious friends who thought he was displaying too heroic a manifestation of continence, failing to understand that he was effecting a sweet compromise with continence. If, moreover, we consider the rarest and finest of the saints, we usually find that in their early lives there was a period of full expansion of the organic activities, in which all the natural impulses had full play. This was the case with the two greatest and most influential saints of the Christian Church, St. Augustine and St. Francis of Assisi. Absolutely unlike, as they were in most other respects, sublimation, we see again and again, is limited. And the best developments of the spiritual life are not likely to come about by the rigid attempt to obtain a complete transmutation of sexual energy. The old notion that any strict attempt to adhere to sexual abstinence is beset by terrible risks insanity, and so forth has no foundation at all events, where we are concerned with reasonably sound and healthy people. But it is a very serious error to suppose that the effort to achieve complete and prolonged sexual abstinence is without any bad results at all physical or psychic, either in men or women who are normal and healthy. This is now generally recognized everywhere except in the English-speaking countries, where the supposed interests of a prudish morality often lead to a refusal to look facts in the face, as Professor Naki, a careful and cautious physician, stated shortly before his death. A few years ago, the opinion that sexual abstinence has no bad effects is not today held by a single authority on questions of sex. The fight is only concerned with the nature and degree of the bad effects, which in Naki's belief, and he was doubtless right, never of a gravely serious character. Yet we have also to remember that not only, as we have seen, is the effort to achieve complete abstinence which we ignorantly term purity futile, since we are concerned with a force which is being constantly generated within the organism, but in the effort to achieve it, we are abusing a great source of beneficent energy. We lose more than half of what we might gain when we cover it up and try to push it back to produce it, maybe not harmonious activity in the world, but merely internal confusion and distortion, and perhaps the paralysis of half the soul's energy. The sexual activities of the organism, we cannot too often repeat, constitute a mighty source of energy, which we can never altogether repress, though by wise guidance we may render it an aid not only to personal development and well-being, but to the moral betterment of the world. The attraction of sex, according to a superstition which reaches far back into antiquity, is a baleful comet pointing to destruction, rather than a mighty star, to which we may harness our chariot. It may certainly be either, and which it is likely to become depends largely on our knowledge and our power of self-guidance. In old days, when, as we have seen, tradition, aided by the most fantastic superstitions, insisted on the baleful aspects of sex, the whole emphasis was placed against passion, since knowledge and self-guidance, without which passion is likely to be in fact pernicious, were then usually absent. The emphasis was needed. And when Boehme, the old mystic, declared that the art of living is to harness our fiery energies to the service of the light, it has recently been even maintained that he was the solitary pioneer of our modern doctrines. But the ages in which ill-regulated passion exceeded ages, at least full of vitality and energy, gave place to a more amic society. Today the conditions are changed. Even reversed moral maxims that were wholesome in feudal days are deadly now. We are in no danger of suffering from too much vitality, from too much energy, in the explosive splendor of our social life. We possess, moreover, knowledge in plenty and self-restraint in plenty, even in excess. However wrongly they may sometimes be applied, it is passion, more passion, and fuller, that we need. The moralist who bans passion is not of our time. His place, these many years, is with the dead, for we know what happens in a world when those who ban passion have triumphed. When love is suppressed, hate takes its place. The least regulated orgies of love grow innocent beside the orgies of hate, when nations that might well worship one another cut one another's throats, when cruelty and self-righteousness and lying and injustice and all the powers of destruction rule the human heart, the world is devastated, the fiber of the whole organism of society grows flaccid, and all the ideals of civilization are debased. If the world is not now sick of hate, we may be sure it never will be so. Whatever may happen to the world, let us remember that the individual is still left to carry on the tasks of love, to do good, even in an evil world. It is more passion, and ever more, that we need, if we are to undo the work of hate, if we are to add to the gaiety and splendor of life, to the sum of human achievement, to the aspiration of human ecstasy, the things that fill men and women with beauty and exhilaration, and spur them to actions beyond themselves, are the things that are now needed. The entire intrinsic purification of the soul, it was held by the great Spanish Jesuit theologian Suarez, takes place at the moment when, provided the soul is of good disposition, it sees God. He meant after death, but for us the saying is symbolic of the living truth. It is only in the passion of facing the naked beauty of the world and its naked truth that we can win intrinsic purity. Not all, indeed, who look upon the face of God can live. It is not well that they should live. It is only the metals that can be welded in the fire of passion to finer services that the world needs. It would be well that the rest should be lost in those flames. that indeed were a world fit to perish, wherein the moralist had set up the ignoble maxim safety first. Chapter 3. The objects of marriage. What are the legitimate objects of marriage? We know that many people seek to marry for ends that can scarcely be called legitimate, that men may marry to obtain a cheap domestic drudge or nurse, and that women may marry to be kept when they are tired of keeping themselves. These objects in marriage may or may not be moral, but in any case, they are scarcely its legitimate ends. We are here concerned to ascertain those ends of marriage, which are legitimate when we take the highest ground as moral and civilized men and women living in an advanced state of society, and seeking, if we can, to advance that state of society still further. The primary end of marriage is to beget and bear offspring, and to rear them, until they are able to take care of themselves. On that basis man is at one with all the mammals, and most of the birds, if indeed we disregard the originally less essential part of this, and that is to say the care and tending of the young. Thigh's end of marriage is not only the primary, but usually the sole end of sexual intercourse in the whole mammal world. As a natural instinct, its achievement involves gratification and well-being, but this bait of gratification is merely a device of nature's, and not in itself an end having any useful function at the periods when conception is not possible. This is clearly indicated by the fact that among animals, the female only experiences sexual desire at the season of impregnation, and that desire ceases as soon as impregnation takes place, though this is only in a few species true of the male, obviously, because if his sexual desire and aptitude were confined to so brief a period, the chances of the female meeting the right male at the right moment would be too seriously diminished, so that the attentive and inquisitive attitude towards the female by the male animal, which we may often think we see still traceable in the human species, not the outcome of lustfulness for personal gratification, wantonly, to satisfy carnal lusts and appetites like brute beasts, as the Anglican prayer book incorrectly puts it, but implanted by nature for the benefit of the female, and the attainment of the primary object of procreation. This primary object we may term the animal end of marriage. This object remains not only the primary, but even the sole end of marriage among the lower races of mankind. Generally, the erotic idea in its deeper sense, that is to say the element of love, arose very slowly in mankind. It is found it is true among some lower races, and it appears that some tribes possess a word for the joy of love in a purely psychic sense. But even among European races, the evolution was late. The Greek poets, except the latest, showed little recognition of love as an element of marriage. Theognis compared marriage with cattle breeding. The Romans of the Republic took much the same view. Greeks and Romans alike regarded breeding as the one recognizable object of marriage. Any other object was mere wantonness, and had better, they thought, be carried on outside marriage. Religion, which preserves so many ancient and primitive conceptions of life, has consecrated this conception also, and Christianity, though, as I will point out later, it has tended to enlarge the conception at the outset, only offered the choice between celibacy on the one hand, and on the other marriage for the production of offspring. Yet from an early period in human history, a secondary function of sexual intercourse had been slowly growing up to become one of the great objects of marriage among animals, it may be said, and even sometimes in man. The sexual impulse, when once aroused, makes but a short and swift circuit through the brain to reach its consummation. But as the brain and its faculties develop, powerfully aided indeed by the very difficulties of the sexual life, the impulse for sexual union has to traverse ever longer, slower, more painful paths before it reaches, and sometimes it never reaches its ultimate object. This means that sex gradually becomes intertwined with all the highest and subtlest human emotions and activities, with the refinements of social intercourse, with high adventure in every sphere, with art, with religion. The primitive animal instinct, having the sole end of procreation, becomes on its way to that end the inspiring stimulus to all those psychic energies which in civilization we count most precious. This function is thus, we see, a byproduct, but as we know, even in our human factories, the byproduct is sometimes more valuable than the product. That is so as regards the functional products of human evolution. The hand was produced out of the animal forelimb with the primary end of grasping the things we materially need. But as a byproduct, the hand has developed the function of making and playing the piano and the violin, and that secondary functional byproduct of the hand we account, even as measured by the rough test of money, more precious, however less materially necessary than its primary function. It is, however, only in rare and gifted natures that transformed sexual energy becomes of supreme value for its own sake without ever attaining the normal physical outlet. For the most part, the byproduct accompanies the product throughout, thus adding a secondary, yet peculiarly sacred and specially human object of marriage to its primary animal object. This may be termed the spiritual object of marriage. By the term spiritual, we are not to understand any mysterious and supernatural qualities. It is simply a convenient name in distinction from animal to cover all those higher mental and emotional processes, which in human evolution are ever gaining greater power. It is needless to enumerate the constituents of this spiritual end of sexual intercourse, for everyone is entitled to enumerate them differently, and in different order. They include not only all that makes love a gracious and beautiful erotic art, but the whole element of pleasure insofar as pleasure is more than a mere animal gratification. Our ancient ascetic traditions often make us blind to the meaning of pleasure. We see only its possibilities of evil, and not its mightiness for good. We forget that, as Ramin Roland says, joy is as holy as pain. No one has insisted so much on the supreme importance of the element of pleasure in the spiritual ends of sex as James Hinton. Rightly used, he declares pleasure is the child of God to be recognized as a mighty storehouse of force, and he pointed out the significant fact that in the course of human progress, its importance increases rather than diminishes. 8. While it is perfectly true that sexual energy may be in large degree arrested and transformed into intellectual and moral forms, yet it is also true that pleasure itself, and above all sexual pleasure wisely used and not abused, may prove the stimulus and liberator of our finest and most exalted activities. It is largely this remarkable function of sexual pleasure which is decisive in settling the argument of those who claim that continence is the only alternative to the animal end of marriage. That argument ignores the liberating and harmonizing influences, giving wholesome balance and sanity to the whole organism, imparted by a sexual union, which is the outcome of the psychic as well as physical needs. There is further in the attainment of the spiritual end of marriage much more than the benefit of each individual separately. There is, that is to say, the effect on the union itself, for through harmonious sex relationships, a deeper spiritual unity is reached than can possibly be derived from continence in or out of marriage, and the marriage association becomes an apter instrument in the service of the world. Apart from any sexual craving, the complete spiritual contact of two persons who love each other can only be attained through some act of rare intimacy. No act can be quite so intimate as the sexual embrace in its accomplishment for all who have reached a reasonably human degree of development. The communion of bodies becomes the communion of souls. The outward and visible sign has been the consummation of an inward and spiritual grace. I would base all my sex teaching to children and young people on the beauty and sacredness of sex. Wrote a distinguished woman, sex intercourse is the great sacrament of life. He that eateth and drinketh unworthily eateth and drinketh his own damnation. But it may be the most beautiful sacrament between two souls who have no thought of children. 9. To many the idea of a sacrament seems merely ecclesiastical, but that is a misunderstanding. The word sacrament is the ancient Roman name of a soldier's oath of military allegiance, and the idea in the deeper sense existed long before Christianity and has ever been regarded as the physical sign of the closest possible union with some great spiritual reality. From our modern standpoint, we may say with James Hinton that the sexual embrace, worthily understood, can only be compared with music, and with prayer. Every true lover, it has been well said by a woman, knows this, and the worth of any and every relationship can be judged by its success in reaching or failing to reach this standpoint. I have mentioned how the Church, in part influenced by that clinging to primitive conceptions, which always marks religions, and in part by its ancient traditions of asceticism, tended to insist mainly if not exclusively on the animal object of marriage. It sought to reduce sex to a minimum, because the pagans magnified sex. It banned pleasure, because the Christian's path on earth was the way of the cross, and even if theologians accepted the idea of a sacrament of nature, they could only allow it to operate when the active interference of the priest was impossible, though it must in justice be said that before the Council of Trent, the Western Church recognized that the sacrament of marriage was effected entirely by the act of the two celebrants themselves, and not by the priest. Gradually, however, a more reasonable and humane opinion crept into the Church. Intercourse outside the animal end of marriage was indeed a sin, but it became merely a venial sin. The great influence of St. Augustine was on the side of allowing much freedom to intercourse outside the aim of procreation at the Reformation. John Alasco, a Catholic bishop who became a Protestant and settled in England, laid it down following various earlier theologians that the object of marriage besides offspring was to serve as a sacrament of consolation to the united couple, and that view was more or less accepted by the founders of the Protestant churches. It is the generally accepted Protestant view today the importance of the spiritual end of intercourse in marriage, alike for the higher development of each member of the couple, and for the intimacy and stability of their union, is still more emphatically set forth by the more advanced thinkers of today. There is something pathetic in the spectacle of those among us who are still only able to recognize the animal end of marriage, and who point to the example of the lower animals among whom the biological conditions are entirely differentes, worthy of our imitation. It has taken God or nature, if we will, known millions of years of painful struggle to evolve man, and to raise the human species above that helpless bondage to reproduction which marks the lower animals. But on these people, it has all been wasted. They are at the animal stage still. They have yet to learn the AB Roman 100 of love. A representative of these people in the person of an Anglican bishop, the Bishop of Southwark, appeared as a witness before the National Birth Rate Commission, which a few years ago met in London to investigate the decline of the birth rate. He declared that procreation is the sole legitimate object of marriage, and that intercourse for any other end was a degrading act of mere self-gratification. This declaration had the interesting result of evoking the comments of many members of the commission, formed of representative men and women with various standpoints, Protestant, Catholic, and other. And it is notable that while not one identified himself with the bishop's opinions, several decisively opposed that opinion as contrary to the best beliefs of both ancient and modern times, as representing a low and not a high moral standpoint, and as involving the notion that the whole sexual activity of an individual should be reduced to perhaps 2 or 3 effective acts of intercourse in a lifetime. Such a notion obviously cannot be carried into general practice, putting aside the question as to whether it would be desirable, and it may be added that it would have the further result of shutting out from the life of love altogether all those persons who for whatever reason feel that it is their duty to refrain from having children at all. It is the attitude of a handful of Pharisees seeking to thrust the bulk of mankind into hell. All this confusion and evil comes of the blindness which cannot know that beyond the primary animal end of propagation in marriage, there is a secondary, but more exalted spiritual end. It is needless to insist how intimately that secondary end of marriage is bound up with the practice of birth control. Without birth control, indeed, it could frequently have no existence at all, and even at the best seldom be free from disconcerting possibilities fatal to its very essence. Against these disconcerting possibilities is often placed on the other side the unesthetic nature of the contraceptives associated with birth control, yet it must be remembered they are of a part with the whole of our civilized human life. We at no point enter the spiritual save through the material. Forel has in this connection compared the use of contraceptives to the use of eyeglasses. Eyeglasses are equally unesthetic, yet they are devices based on nature, wherewith to supplement the deficiencies of nature. However in themselves unesthetic, for those who need them, they make the aesthetic possible. Eyeglasses and contraceptives, alike, are a portal to the spiritual world for many who without them would find that world largely a closed book. Birth control is affecting and promising to affect many functions in our social life by furnishing the means to limit the size of families, which would otherwise be excessive. It confers the greatest benefit on the family, and especially on the mother, by rendering easily possible a selection in parenthood and the choice of the right time and circumstances for conception. It is again the chief key to the eugenic improvement of the race. There are many other benefits, as is now generally becoming clear, which will be derived from the rightly applied practice of birth control. To many of us, it is not the least of these that birth control effects, finally, the complete liberation of the spiritual object of marriage. Chapter 4. Husbands and Wives. It has always been common to discuss the psychology of women. The psychology of men has usually been passed over whether because it is too simple or too complicated. But the marriage question today is much less the wife problem than the husband problem. Women in their personal and social activities have been slowly expanding along lines which are now generally accepted, but there has been no marked change of responsive character in the activities of men. Hence, a defective adjustment of men and women felt in all sorts of subtle as well as grosser ways, most felt when they are husband and wife, and sometimes becoming acute. It is necessary to make clear that as is here assumed at the outset, man and husband are not quite the same thing even when they refer to the same person, no doubt. That is also true of woman and wife. A woman in her quality, as woman, may be a different kind of person from what she is in her function as wife. But in the case of a man, the distinction is more marked. One may know a man well in the world as a man, and not know him at all in his home, as a husband not necessarily. That he is unfavorably revealed in the latter capacity, it is simply that he is different. The explanation is not really far to seek. A man in the world is in vital response to the influences around him, but a husband in the home is playing a part, which was created for him long centuries. Before he was born, he is falling into a convention, which indeed was molded to fit many masculine human needs, but has become rigidly traditionalized. Thus the part no longer corresponds accurately to the player's nature, nor to the circumstances under which it has to be played. In the marriage system which has prevailed in our world for several thousand years, a certain hierarchy or sacred order in authority has throughout been recognized. The family has been regarded as a small state of which the husband and father is head. Classic paganism and Christianity differed on many points, but they were completely at one on this. The Roman system was on a patriarchal basis, and continued to be so theoretically, even when in practice it came to allow great independence to the wife. Christianity, although it allowed complete spiritual freedom to the individual, introduced no fundamentally new theory of the family, and indeed reinforced the old theory by regarding the family as a little church of which the husband was the head, just as Christ is the head of the church. St. Paul repeatedly asserted. So the husband is the head of the wife. Therefore, as it was constantly argued during the Middle Ages, a man is bound to rule his wife. St. Augustine, the most influential of Christian fathers, even said that a wife should be proud to consider herself as the servant of her husband. His ancilla, a word that had in it the suggestion of slave, that was the underlying assumption throughout the Middle Ages, for the northern Germanic peoples, having always been accustomed to wife purchase before their conversion, had found it quite easy to assimilate the Christian view. Protestantism, even Puritanism, with its associations of spiritual revolt, so far from modifying the accepted attitude, strengthened it, for they found authority for all social organization in the Bible. And the Bible revealed an emphatic predominance of the Jewish husband, who possessed essential rights, to which the wife had no claim. Milton, who had the poet's sensitiveness to the loveliness of woman, and the lonely man's feeling for the solace of her society, was yet firmly assured of the husband's superiority over his wife. He has indeed furnished the classical picture of it in Adam and Eve. He for God, only she for God in him. And to that God she owed subjection, even though she might qualify it by sweet reluctant amorous delay. This was completely in harmony with the legal position of the wife. As a subject she was naturally in subjection. She owed her husband the same loyalty as a subject owes the sovereign. Her disloyalty to him was termed a minor form of treason. If she murdered him, the crime was legally worse than murder, and she rendered herself liable to be burnt. We see that all the influences on our civilization, religious and secular, southern and northern, have combined to mold the underlying bony structure of our family system in such a way that, however it may appear softened and disguised on the surface, the husband is the head, and the wife subject to him. We must not be supposed hereby to deny that the wife has had much authority, many privileges, considerable freedom, and in individual cases, much opportunity to domineer. Whatever superiority, custom, or brute strength may have given the husband, there are henpecked husbands. It has been remarked even in Aboriginal Australia. It is necessary to avoid the error of those enthusiasts for the emancipation of women who, out of their eager faith in the future of women, used to describe her past as one of scarcely mitigated servitude and hardship. If women had not constantly succeeded in overcoming or eluding the difficulties that beset them in the past, it would be foolish to cherish any faith in their future. It must moreover be remembered that the very constitution of that ecclesiastico-feudal hierarchy, which made the husband supreme over the wife, also made the wife jointly with her husband supreme over their children and over their servants. The Middle Ages, alike in England and in France as doubtless in Christendom, generally accepted the rule laid down in Gratian's Decretum, the great medieval textbook of canon law, that the husband may chastise his wife temperately, for she is of his household, but the wife might chastise her daughters and her servants, and she sometimes exercised that right in ways that we should nowadays think scarcely temperate. If we seek to observe how the system worked some 500 years ago, when it had not yet become, as it is today, both weakened and disguised, we cannot do better than turn to the Paston Letters, the most instructive documents we possess concerning the domestic life of excellent, yet fairly average people of the upper middle class in England. In the 15th century, marriage was still frankly and fundamentally, as it was in the following century, and less frankly later a commercial transaction. The wooer, when he had a wife in view, stated as a matter of course that he proposed to deal in the matter. It was quite recognized on both sides that love and courtship must depend on whether the deal came off satisfactorily. John Paston approached Sir Thomas Bruce through a third person with a view to negotiate a marriage with his daughter Marjorie. She was willing, even eager, and while the matter was still uncertain, she wrote him a letter on Valentine's Day, addressing him as right reverent and worshipful, and my right well-beloved Valentine, to tell him that it was impossible for her father to offer a larger dowry than he had already promised, if that you could be content with that good, and my poor person, I would be the merriest maiden on ground. In his first letter, boldly written, he says, without her knowledge or license, addresses her simply as mistress, and assures her that I am and will be yours, and at your commandment in every wise during my life. A few weeks later, addressing him as right worshipful master, she calls him mine own sweetheart, and ends up, as she frequently does, your servant and bedeswoman. Some months later, a few weeks after marriage, she addresses her husband, in the correct manner of the time, as right reverent and worshipful husband, asking him to buy her a gown, as she is weary of wearing her present one. It is so cumbrous. 5 years later, she refers to all the babies and writes in haste, right reverent and worshipful sir, in my most humble wise, I recommend me unto you, as lowly as I can, etc., though she adds in a postscript, please you to send for me, for I think long since I lay in your arms. If we turn to another wife of the Paston family, a little earlier in the century, Margaret Paston, whose husband's name also was John, we find the same attitude even more distinctly expressed. She always addressed him, in her most familiar letters, showing affectionate concern for his welfare, as right reverent and worshipful husband or right worshipful master. It is seldom that he writes to her at all, but when he writes, the superscription is simply to my mistress Paston, or my cousin, with little greeting at either beginning or end. Once only, with unexampled effusion, he writes to her as my own dear sovereign lady, and signs himself your true and trusting husband. If we turn to France, the relation of the wife to her husband was the same or even more definitely dependent, for he occupied the place of father to her, as well as of husband and sovereign. In this respect, carrying on a tradition of Roman law, she was her husband's wife and subject. She signed herself Vostre humble obeisante, fil et ami. If also we turn to the book of the Chevalier de la Tour Landry in Anjou, written at the end of the 14th century, we find a picture of the relations of women to men in marriage, comparable to that presented in the Paston Letters, though of a different order. This book was, as we know, written for the instruction of his daughters, by a knight who seems to have been a fairly average man of his time in his beliefs, and in character, as he has been described, probably above it, a man of the world, a Christian, a parent, and a gentleman. His book is full of interesting light on the customs and manners of his day, though it is mainly a picture of what the writer thought ought to be, rather than what always was. Herein the knight is sagacious and moderate. Much of his advice is admirably sound for every age. He is less concerned with affirming the authority of husbands than with assuring the happiness and well-being of his dearly loved daughters, but he clearly finds this bound up with the recognition of the authority of the husband, and the demands he makes are fairly concordant with the relationships we see established among the Pastons. The knight abounds in illustrations from Lot's daughters down to his own time, for the example, or the warning of his daughters. The ideal he holds up to them is strictly domestic, and in a sense conventional. He puts the matter on practical, rather than religious or legal grounds, and his fundamental assumption is that no woman ought ever to thwart or refuse to obey the ordinance of her lord, that is, if she is either desirous to be mistress of his affections or to have peace and understanding in the house. For very evident reasons, submission should begin on her part. One would like to know what duties the knight inculcated on husbands, but the corresponding book he wrote for the guidance of his sons appears no longer to be extant. On the whole, the fundamental traditions of our Western world concerning the duties of husbands and wives are well summed up in what Pollock and Maitland term that curious cabinet of antiquities, the marriage ritual of the English church here, we find that the husband promises to love and cherish the wife. But she promises not only to love and cherish, but also to obey him, though it may be noted this point was not introduced into English marriage rites until the 14th century, when the wife promised to be buxom, which then meant submissive, and bon air, courteous and kind, while in some French and Spanish rites it has never been introduced at all. But we may take it to be generally implied in the final address to the married couple. The priest admonishes the bride that the husband is the head of the wife, and that her part is submission in some more ancient and local rituals. This point was further driven home, and on the delivery of the ring the bride knelt and kissed the bridegroom's right foot in course of time. This was modified at all events in France, and she simply dropped the ring so that her motion of stooping was regarded. As for the purpose of picking it up, I note that change for it is significant of the ways in which we modify the traditions of the past, not quite abandoning them, but pretending that they have other than the fundamental original motives. We see just the same thing in the use of the ring, which was in the first place a part of the bride price, frequently accompanied by money proof that the wife had been duly purchased. It was thus made easy to regard the ring as really a golden fetter. That idea soon became offensive, and the new idea was originated that the ring was a pledge of affection. Thus, quite early in some countries, the husband also wore a wedding ring. The marriage order illustrated by the Paston Letters, and the Book of the Chevalier de la Tour Landry before the Reformation, and the Anglican Book of Common Prayer afterwards, has never been definitely broken. It is a part of our living tradition today. But during recent centuries, it has been overlaid by the growth of new fashions and sentiments, which have softened its hard outlines to the view. It has been disguised, notably during the 18th century, by the development of a new feeling of social equality, chiefly initiated in France, which in an atmosphere of public intercourse, largely regulated by women, made the ostentatious assertion of the husband's headship over his wife displeasing and even ridiculous. Then, especially in the 19th century, there began another movement chiefly initiated in England and carried further in America, which affected the foundations of the husband's position from beneath. This movement consisted in a great number of legislative measures and judicial pronouncements and administrative orders, each small in itself and never coordinate, which, taken altogether, have had a cumulative effect in immensely increasing the rights of the wife independently of her husband, or even in opposition to him. Thus, at the present time, the husband's authority has been overlaid by new social conventions from above and undermined by new legal regulations from below. Yet it is important to realize, although the husband's domestic throne has been in appearance elegantly recovered, and in substance has become wormy, it still stands and still retains its ancient shape and structure. There has never been a French Revolution in the home, and that revolution itself, which modified society so extensively, scarcely modified the legal supremacy of the husband at all, even in France under the Code Napoleon, and still less anywhere else interwoven with all the new developments, and however less obtrusive it may have become, the old tradition still continues among us, since also the husband is conventionally, and in large measure really, the economic support of the hometh work of the wife, and even actual financial contributions, brought by her, not being supposed to affect that convention. This state of things is held to be justified. Thus, when a man enters the home as a husband to seat himself on the antique domestic throne, and to play the part assigned to him of old, he is involuntarily, even unconsciously, following an ancient tradition, and taking his place in a procession of husbands, which began long ages before he was born. It thus comes about that a man, even after he is married, and a husband are two different persons, so that his wife, who mainly knows him as a husband, may be unable to form any just idea of what he is like as a man. As a husband, he has stepped out of the path that belongs to him in the world, and taken on another part, which has called out altogether different reactions. So he is sometimes a much more admirable person in one of these spheres, whichever it may bethen in the other. We must not be surprised if the husband's position has sometimes developed those qualities which, from the modern point of view, are the less admirable in this respect. The sovereign husband resembles the sovereign state. The sovereign state, as it has survived from Renaissance days in our modern world, may be made up of admirable people, yet as a state they are forced into an attitude of helpless egoism, which nowadays fails to commend itself to the outside world, and the tendency of scientific jurists today is to deal very critically with the old conception of the sovereign state. It is so with the husband in the home. He was thrust by ancient tradition into a position of sovereignty, which impelled him to play a part of helpless egoism. He was a celestial body in the home, around which all the other inmates were revolving satellites, the hours of rising and retiring, the times of meals, and their nature and substance, all the activities of the household in which he himself takes little or no part in, still arranged primarily to suit his work, his play, and his tastes. This is an accepted matter of course, and not the result of any violent self-assertion on his part. It is equally an accepted matter of course that the wife should be constantly occupied in keeping this little solar system in easy harmonious movement, evolving from it. If she has the skill, the music of the spheres, she has no recognized independent personality of her own, nor even any right to go away by herself, for a little change and recreation. Any work of her own, play of her own, tastes of her own, must be strictly subordinated, if not suppressed altogether. In the old days, from which our domestic traditions proceed, little hardship was thus inflicted on the wife. Her rights and privileges were indeed far less than those of the modern woman. But for that very reason, the home offered her a larger field beneath the shelter of her husband. The irresponsible wife might exert a maximum of influential activity, with a minimum of rights and privileges of her own. To many men, even today, that state of things seems the realization of an ideal. Yet to women, it seems increasingly less so, and of necessity, since the cleavage between the position of woman in society and law and the position of the wife in the sacramental bonds of wedlock is daily becoming greater. Today, a woman, who possibly for 10 years has been leading her own life of independent work, earning her own living, choosing her own conditions in accordance with her own needs, and selecting her own periods of recreation in accordance with her own tastes, whether or not this may have included the society of a man. From such a woman suddenly finds on marriage, and without any assertion of authority on her husband's part, that all the outward circumstances of her life are reversed and all her inner spontaneous movements arrested. There may be no signs of this on the surface of her conduct. She loves her husband too much to wish to hurt his feelings by explaining the situation, and she values domestic peace too much to risk friction by making unexpected claims. But beneath the surface there is often a profound discontent, and even in women who thought they had gained an insight into life, a sense of disillusion. Everyone knows this, who is privileged to catch a glimpse into the hearts of women, often women of most distinguished intelligence, as well as women of quite ordinary nature, who leave a life of spontaneous activity in the world to enter the home. It is not to be supposed that in this presentation of the situation in the home, as it is today visible to those who are privileged to see beneath the surface, any accusation is brought against the husband, he is no more guilty of an unreasonable conservatism than the wife is guilty of an unreasonable radicalism. Each of them is the outcome of a tradition. The point is that the events of the past 100 years have produced a discrepancy in the two lines of tradition, with a resultant lack of harmony, independent of the goodwill of either husband or wife. Olive Schreiner, in her Woman and Labor, has eloquently set forth the tendency to parasitism which civilization produces in women. They no longer exercise the arts and industries which were theirs in former ages, and so they become economically dependent on men, losing their energies and aptitudes, and becoming like those dull parasitic animals which live as bloodsuckers of their host. That picture, which was of course never true of all women, is now ceasing to be true of any but a negligible minority. It presents moreover a parasitism limited to the economic side of life. For if the wife has often been a lazy, gold-sucking parasite on her husband in the world, the husband has yet oftener been a helpless, service-absorbing parasite on his wife in the home. There is, that is to say, not only an economic parasitism, with no adequate return for financial support, but a still more prevalent domestic parasitism, with an absorption of services for which no return would be adequate. There are many helpful husbands in the home, but there are a larger number who are helpless, and have never been trained to be anything else but helpless even by their wives, who would often detest a rival in household work and management. The average husband enjoys the total effect of his home, but is usually unable to contribute any of the details of work and organization that make it enjoyable. He cannot keep it in order and cleanliness and regulated movement. He seldom knows how to buy the things that are needed for its upkeep, nor how to prepare and cook and present a decent meal. He cannot even attend to his own domestic needs. It is the wife's consolation that most husbands are not always at home. In ministering to the wants of the family, the woman has reduced man to a state of considerable dependency on her in all domestic affairs, just as she is dependent on him for bodily protection in the course of ages. This has gone so far as to foster a peculiar helplessness on the part of the man, which manifests itself in a somewhat childlike reliance of the husband on the wife. In fact, it may be said that the husband is to all intents and purposes incapable of maintaining himself without the aid of a woman. This passage will probably seem to many readers to apply quite fairly well to men as they exist today in most of those lands, which we consider at the summit of our civilization. Yet it was not written of civilization, or of white men, but of the Bantu tribes of East Africa, complete Negroes, who while far from being among the lowest savages belong to a culture which is only just emerging from cannibalism, witchcraft, and customary bloodshed. So close a resemblance between the European husband and the Negro husband significantly suggests how remarkable has been the arrest of development in the husband's customary status during a vast period of the world's history. It is in the considerable group of couples where the husband's work separates him but little from the home that the pressure on the wife is most severe, and without the relief and variety secured by his frequent absence, she has perhaps led a life of her own before marriage. She knows how to be economically independent. Now they occupy a small dwelling. They have maybe one or two small children. They can only afford one helper in the work or none at all. And in this busy little hive, the husband and wife are constantly tumbling over each other. It is small wonder if the wife feels a deep discontent beneath her willing ministrations, and misses the devotion of the lover in the perpetual claims of the husband. But the difficulty is not settled. If she persuades him to take a room outside, he is devoted to his wife and his home with good reason, for the wife makes the home. And he is incapable of making a home. His new domestic arrangements sink into careless and sordid disorder, and he is conscious of profound discomfort. His wife soon realizes that it is a choice between his return to the home and complete separation. Most wives never get even as far as this attempt at solution of the difficulty, and hide their secret discontent. This is the situation which today is becoming intensified and extended on a vast scale. The habit and the taste for freedom, adventure, and economic independence is becoming generated among millions of women who once meekly trod the ancient beaten paths, and we must not be so foolish as to suppose that they can suddenly renounce those habits and tastes at the threshold of marriage. Moreover, it is becoming clear to men and to women alike, and for the first time, that the world can be remolded, and that the claims for better conditions of work, for a higher standard of life, and for the attainment of leisure which previously had only feebly been put forward, may now be asserted drastically. We see therefore today a great revolutionary movement, mainly on the part of men in the world of labor. And we see a corresponding movement, however less ostentatious, mainly on the part of women in the world of the home. It may seem to some that this new movement of upheaval in the sphere of the home is merely destructive. Timid souls have felt the like in every period of transition, and with as little reason, just as we realize that the movement now in progress in the world of labor for a higher standard of life, and for, as it has been termed, a larger lesserization, represents a wholesome revolt against the crushing conditions of prolonged monotonous work, most deadening of all work, and a real advance towards those ideals of democracy which are still so remote. So it is with the movement in the home that also is the claim for a new and fairer allotment of responsibility, of larger opportunities for freedom and leisure. If in the home the husband is still to be regarded as the capitalist, and the wife as the laborer, then at all events, it has to be recognized that he owes her not only the satisfaction of her physical needs of food and shelter and clothing, but the opportunity to satisfy the personal, spontaneous claims of her own individual nature. Just as the readjustment of labor is really only an approach to the long-recognized ideals of democracy, so the readjustment of the home, far from being subversive or revolutionary, is merely an approximation to the long-recognized ideals of marriage. How in practice, one may finally ask, is this readjustment of the home likely to be carried out? In the first place, we are justified in believing that in the future home men will no longer be so helpless, so domestically parasitic. As in the past, this change is indeed already coming about. It is an inestimable benefit throughout life for a man to have been forcibly lifted out of the routine comforts and feminine services of the old-fashioned home, and to be thrown into an alien and solitary environment, face to face with nature, and the essential domestic human needs in my own case, I owe an inestimable debt to the chance that thus flung me into the Australian bush in early life. In one may note that the Great War has had directly and indirectly a remarkable influence in this direction, for it not only compelled women to exercise many enlarging and fortifying functions commonly counted as pertaining to men, it also compelled men, deprived of accustomed feminine services, to develop a new independent ability for organizing domesticity, and that ability, even though it is not permanently exercised in rendering domestic services, must yet always make clear the nature of domestic problems and tend to prevent the demand for unnecessary domestic services. But there is another quite different and more general line along which we may expect this problem to be largely solved, that is by the simplification and organization of domestic life. If that process were carried to the full extent that is now becoming possible, a large part of the problem before us would be at once solved. A great promise for the future of domestic life is held out by the growing adoption of birth control, by which the wife and mother is relieved from that burden of unduly frequent and unwanted maternity, which in the past so often crushed her vitality and destroyed her freshness. But many minor agencies are helpful to supply heat, light, and motive power even to small households, to replace the wasteful, extravagant, and often inefficient home cookery by meals cooked outside, as well as to facilitate the growing social habit of taking meals in spacious public restaurants under more attractive, economical, and wholesome conditions than can usually be secured within the narrow confines of the home, to contract with specially trained workers from outside for all those routines of domestic drudgery which are often so inefficiently and laboriously carried on by the household worker, whether mistress or servant, and to seek perpetually by new devices to simplify, which often means to beautify, all the everyday processes of life. To effect this in any comprehensive degree is to transform the home from the intolerable burden it is sometimes felt to be into a possible haven of peace and joy. The trouble in the past, and even today, has been not in any difficulty in providing the facilities, but in prevailing people to adopt them. Thus in England, even under the stress of the Great War, there was among the working population a considerable disinclination founded on stupid conservatism and a meaningless pride to take advantage of national kitchens and national restaurants, notwithstanding the superiority of the meals in quality, cheapness, and convenience to the workers' home meals, so that many of these establishments, even while still fostered by the government, had speedily to close their doors. Ancient traditions that have now become not only empty, but mischievous in these matters, still fetter the wife even more than the husband. We cannot regulate even the material side of life without cultivating that intelligence in the development of which civilization so largely consists. Intelligence, and even something more than intelligence, is needed along the third line of progress towards the modernized home. Simplification and organization can effect nothing in the desired transformation if they merely end in themselves. They are only helpful in so far as they economize energy, offer a more ample leisure, and extend the opportunities for that play of the intellect, that liberation of the emotions with accompanying discipline of the primitive instincts, which are needed not only for the development of civilization in general, but in particular of the home. Domineering egotism, the assertion of greedy possessive rights, are out of place in the modern home. They are just as mischievous when exhibited by the wife as by the husband. We have seen, as we look back, the futility in the end of the ancient structure of the home, however reasonable it was at the beginning under our different modern social conditions, and for women to attempt nowadays to reintroduce the same structure merely reversed would be not only mischievous, but silly. That spirit of narrow exclusiveness and self-centered egoism, even if it were sometimes an egoisme, a dukes evoked half a century ago the scathing sarcasm of James Hinton, who never wearied of denouncing the virtuous and happy homes, which he saw as floating blotches of verdure on a sea of filth. Such outbursts seem extravagant, but they were the extravagance of an idealist at the vision, which as a physician in touch with realities, he had seen beneath the surface of the home. It is well to insist on the organization of the mechanical and material side of life. Some leaders of women movements feel this so strongly that they insist on nothing else. In old days, it was conventionally supposed that women's sphere was that of the feelings. The result has been that women now often take ostentatious pleasure in washing their hands of feelings and accusing men of sentiment. But that wrongly debased word stands for the whole superstructure of life on the basis of material organization, for all the finer and higher parts of our nature, for the greater part of civilization. The elaboration of the mechanical side of life by itself may merely serve to speed up the pace of life instead of expanding leisure to pile up the weary burden of luxury, and still further, to dissipate the energy of life in petty or frivolous channels, to bring order into the region of soulless machinery running at random, to raise the superstructure of a genuinely human civilization, is not a task which either men or women can afford to fling contemptuously to the opposite sex. It concerns them both equally, and can only be carried out by both equally working side by side, in the most intimate spirit of mutual comprehension, confiding trust, and the goodwill to conquer the demon of jealousy, that dragon which slays love under the pretense of keeping it alive. This task, it may finally be added, is always an adventure. However well organized the foundations of life may be, life must always be full of risks. We may smile, therefore, when it is remarked that the future developments of the home are risky birds in the air and fishes in the sea. Quite as much as our own ancestors on the earth have always found life full of risks, it was the greatest risk of all when they insisted on continuing on the old outworn ways, and so became extinct. If the home is an experiment and a risky experiment, one can only say that life is always like that. We have to see to it that in this central experiment, on which our happiness so largely depends, all our finest qualities are mobilized. Even the smallest homes under the new conditions cannot be built to last with small minds and small hearts. Indeed, the discipline of the home demands not only the best intellectual qualities that are available, but often involve in men, as well as in women, a spiritual training, fit to make sweeter and more generous saints than any cloister. The greater the freedom, the more complete the equality of husband and wife, the greater the possibilities of discipline and development. In view of the rigidities and injustices of the law, many couples nowadays dispense with legal marriage and form their own private contract. That method has sometimes proved more favorable to the fidelity and permanence of love than external compulsion. It assists the husband to remain the lover, and it is often the lover more than the husband that the modern woman needs. But it has always to be remembered that in the present condition of law and social opinion, a slur is cast on the children of such unions. No doubt, however, marriage and the home will undergo modifications, which will tend to make these ancient institutions a little more flexible, and to permit a greater degree of variation to meet special circumstances. We can occupy ourselves with no more essential task, whether as regards ourselves or the race, than to make more beautiful the house of life for the dwelling of love. Chapter 5. The Love Rights of Women. What is the part of woman? One is sometimes asked in the sex act. Must it be the wife's concern in the marital embrace to sacrifice her own wishes from a sense of love and duty towards her husband? Or is the wife entitled to an equal mutual interest and joy in this act with her husband? It seems a simple problem in so fundamental a relationship, which goes back to the beginning of sex. In the dawn of life, it might appear that we could leave nature to decide, yet it is not so throughout the history of civilization. Wherever we can trace the feelings and ideas which have prevailed on this matter, and the resultant conduct, the problem has existed often to produce discord, conflict, and misery. The problem still exists today, and with as important results as in the past. In nature, before the arrival of man, it can scarcely be said, indeed, that any difficulty existed. It was taken for granted at that time that the female had both the right to her own body and the right to a certain amount of enjoyment in the use of it. It often cost the male a serious amount of trouble, though he never failed to find it worthwhile to explain to her the point where he may be allowed to come in, and to persuade her that he can contribute to her enjoyment. So it generally is throughout nature before we reach man, and though it is not invariably obvious, we often find it even among the unlikeliest animals. As is well known, it is most pronounced among the birds, who have in some species carried the erotic art and faithful devotion, which properly accompanied the erotic art, as being an essential part of ito. The highest point we have here the great natural fact of courtship throughout nature. Wherever we meet with animals of a high type, often indeed, when they are of a lowly type, provided they have not been rendered unnatural by domestication, every act of sexual union is preceded by a process of courtship. There is a sound physiological reason for this courtship, for in the act of wooing and being wooed, the psychic excitement gradually generated in the brains of the two partners acts as a stimulant to arouse into full activity the mechanism which ensures sexual union, and aids ultimate impregnation. Such courtship is thus a fundamental natural fact. It is as a natural fact that we still find it in full development among a large number of peoples of the lower races, whom we are accustomed to regard as more primitive than ourselves. New conditions, it is true, soon enter to complicate the picture presented by savage courtship. The economic element of bargaining, destined to prove so important, comes in at an early stage, and among peoples leading a violent life, and constantly fighting, it has sometimes happened, though not always, that courtship also has been violent. This is not so frequent, as was once supposed. With better knowledge, it was found that the seeming brutality once thought to take the place of courtship among various peoples in a low state of culture was really itself, courtship, a rough kind of play agreeable to both parties, and not depriving the feminine partner of her own freedom of choice. This was notably the case as regards so-called marriage by capture. While this is sometimes a real capture, it is more often a mock capture. The lover perhaps pursues the beloved on horseback, but she is as fleet and as skillful as he is, cannot be captured unless she wishes to be captured. And in addition, as among the Kyrgyz, she may be armed with a formidable whip, so that marriage by capture, far from being a hardship imposed on women, is largely a concession to their modesty and a gratification of their erotic impulses. Even when the chief part of the decision rests with masculine force, courtship is still not necessarily, or usually, excluded for the exhibition of force by a lover, and this is true for civilized as well as for savage women. Is itself a source of pleasurable stimulation. And when that is so, the essence of courtship may be attained even more successfully by the forceful than by the humble lover. The evolution of society, however, tended to overlay, and sometimes even to suppress, those fundamental natural tendencies: the position of the man as the sole and uncontested head of the family, the insistence on paternity and male descent, the accompanying economic developments, and the tendency to view a woman less as a self-disposing individual than as an object of barter belonging to her father, the consequent rigidity of the marriage bond, and the stern insistence on wifely fidelity. All these conditions of developing civilization, while still leaving courtship possible, diminished its significance, and even abolished its necessity. Moreover, on the basis of the social, economic, and legal developments thus established, new moral, spiritual, and religious forces were slowly generated, which worked on these rules of merely exterior order, and interiorized them, thus giving them power over the souls as well as over the bodies of women. The result was that, directly and indirectly, the legal, economic, and erotic rights of women were all diminished. It is with the erotic rights only that we are here concerned. No doubt, in its erotic aspects, as well as in its legal and economic aspects, the social order thus established was described, and in good faith, as beneficial to women, and even as maintained in their interests. Monogamy and the home, it was claimed, alike existed for the benefit and protection of women. It was not so often explained that they greatly benefited and protected men, with moreover this additional advantage, that while women were absolutely confined to the home, men were free to exercise their activities outside the home, even with tacit general consent on the erotic side. Whatever the real benefits, and there is no occasion for questioning them, of the sexual order thus established, it becomes clear that in certain important respects, it had an unnatural and repressive influence on the erotic aspect of woman's sexual life. It fostered the reproductive side of woman's sexual life, but it rendered difficult for her the satisfaction of the instinct for that courtship which is the natural preliminary of reproductive activity, an instinct even more highly developed in the female than in the male, and the more insistent, because in the order of nature, the burden of maternity is preceded by the reward of pleasure. But the marriage order which had become established led to the indirect result of banning pleasure in women, or at all events in wives. It was regarded as too dangerous, and even as degrading. The women who wanted pleasure were not considered fit for the home, but more suited to be devoted to an exclusive life of pleasure, which soon turned out to be not their own pleasure, but men's. A life of pleasure in that sense, or in any other sense, was not what more than a small minority of women ever desired. The desire of women for courtship is not a thing by itself, and was not implanted for gratification by itself. It is naturally intertwined, and, to a much greater degree than the corresponding desire in men, with her deepest personal family and social instincts, so that if these are desecrated and lost, its charm soon fades. The practices and the ideals of this established morality were both due to men, and both were so thoroughly fashioned that they subjugated alike the actions and the feelings of women. There is no sphere which we regard as so peculiarly women's sphere as that of love, yet there is no sphere which in civilization women have so far had so small a part in regulating their deepest impulse. Their modesty, their maternity, their devotion, their emotional receptivity were used with no conscious and deliberate Machiavellism against themselves to mold a moral world for their habitation which they would not themselves have molded. It is not of modern creation, nor by any means due, as some have supposed, to the asceticism of Christianity. However much Christianity may have reinforced it, indeed one may say that in course of time, Christianity had an influence in weakening it, for Christianity discovered a new reservoir of tender emotion, and such emotion may be transferred, and as a matter of fact was transferred from its first religious channel into erotic channels, which were thereby deepened and extended, and without reference to any design of Christianity, for the ends we achieve are often by no means those which we set out to accomplish in ancient classic days. This moral order was even more severely established than in the Middle Ages. Montaigne, in the 16th century, declared that marriage is a devout and religious relationship. The pleasures derived from it should be restrained and serious, mixed with some severity. But in this matter, he was not merely expressing the Christian standpoint, but even more that of paganism, and he thoroughly agreed with the old Greek moralist that a man should approach his wife prudently and severely for fear of inciting her to lasciviousness. He thought that marriage was best arranged by a third party, and was inclined to think with the ancients that women are not fitted to make friends of. Montaigne has elsewhere spoken with insight of women's instinctive knowledge of the art and discipline of love, and has pointed out how men have imposed their own ideals and rules of action on women from whom they have demanded opposite and contradictory virtues. Yet we see he approves of this state of things, and never suggests that women have any right to opinions of their own or feelings of their own when the sacred institution of marriage is in question. Montaigne represents the more exalted aspects of the pagan Christian conception of morality in marriage, which still largely prevails, but that conception lent itself to deductions, frankly accepted even by Montaigne himself, which were by no means exalted. I find, said Montaigne, that Venus, after all, is nothing more than the pleasure of discharging our vessels, just as nature renders pleasurable the discharges from other parts. Sir Thomas More, among Catholics, and Luther among Protestants, said exactly the same thing in other and even clearer words, while untold millions of husbands in Christendom, down to today, whether or not they have had the wit to put their theory into a phrase, have regularly put it into practice, at all events within the consecrated pale of marriage, and treated their wives severely and prudently as convenient utensils for the reception of a natural excretion. Obviously, in this view of marriage, sexual activity was regarded as an exclusively masculine function, in the exercise of which women had merely a passive part to play. Any active participation on her side thus seemed unnecessary, and even unbefitting. Finally, though only in comparatively modern times, disgusting and actually degrading. Thus, Acton, who was regarded half a century ago as the chief English authority on sexual matters, declared that, happily for society, the supposition that women possess sexual feelings could be put aside as a vile aspersion, while another medical authority of the same period stated in regard to the most simple physical sign of healthy sexual emotion that it only happens in lascivious women. This final triumph of the masculine ideals and rule of life was, however, only achieved slowly. It was the culmination of an elaborate process of training. At the outset, men had found it impossible to speak too strongly of the wantonness of women. This attitude was pronounced among the ancient Greeks and prominent in their dramatists. Christianity, again, which ended by making women into the chief pillars of the Church, began by regarding them as the gate of hell. Again, later, when in the Middle Ages this masculine moral order approached the task of subjugating the barbarians of Northern Europe, men were horrified at the licentiousness of those northern women, at whose coldness they are now shocked. That indeed was as Montaigne had seen the central core of conflict in the rule of life imposed by men on women. Men were perpetually striving by ways the most methodical, the most subtle, the most far-reaching to achieve a result in women, which when achieved men themselves viewed with dismay. They may be said to be moved in this sphere by two passions, the passion for virtue and the passion for vice. But it so happens that both these streams of passion have to be directed at the same fascinating object, woman, no doubt. Nothing is more admirable than the skill with which women have acquired the duplicity necessary to play the two contradictory parts thus imposed upon them. But in that requirement, the play of their natural reactions tended to become paralyzed, and the delicate mechanism of their instincts often disturbed. They were forbidden, except in a few carefully etiquetted forms, the free play of courtship, without which they could not perform their part in the erotic life with full satisfaction either to themselves or their partners. They were reduced to an artificial simulation of coldness or of warmth according to the particular stage of the dominating masculine ideal of woman which their partner chanced to have reached. But that is an attitude equally unsatisfactory to themselves and to their lovers, even when the latter have not sufficient insight to see through its unreality. It is an attitude so unnatural and artificial that it inevitably tends to produce a real coldness, which nothing can disguise. It is true that women whose instincts are not perverted at the roots do not desire to be cold, far from it. But to dispel that coldness, the right atmosphere is needed, and the insight and skill of the right man in the erotic sphere. A woman asks nothing better of a man than to be lifted above her coldness to the higher plane, where there is reciprocal interest and mutual joy in the act of love. Therein her silent demand is one with nature's, for the biological order of the world involves those claims which in the human range are the erotic rights of women. The social claims of women, their economic claims, their political claims have long been before the world. Women themselves have actively asserted them, and they are all in process of realization. The erotic claims of women, which are at least as fundamental, are not publicly voiced, and women themselves would be the last to assert them. It is easy to understand why that should be so. The natural and acquired qualities of women, even the qualities developed in the art of courtship, have all been utilized in building up the masculine ideal of sexual morality. It is on feminine characteristics that this masculine ideal has been based, so that women have been helpless to protest against it. Moreover, even if that were not so, to formulate such rights is to raise the question whether there so much as exists anything that can be called erotic rights. The right to joy cannot be claimed in the same way as one claims the right to put a voting paper in a ballot box. A human being's erotic aptitudes can only be developed where the right atmosphere for them exists, and where the attitudes of both persons concerned are in harmonious sympathy. That is why the erotic rights of women have been the last of all to be attained. Yet today we see a change here. The change required is, it has been said, a change of attitude, and a resultant change in the atmosphere in which the sexual impulses are manifested. It involves no necessary change in the external order of our marriage system, for as has already been pointed out, it was a coincident and not designed part of that order. Various recent lines of tendency have converged to produce this change of attitude and of atmosphere. In part, the men of today are far more ready than the men of former days to look upon women as their comrades in the everyday work of the world, instead of as beings who were ideally on a level above themselves, and practically on a level considerably below themselves. In part, there is the growing recognition that women have conquered many elementary human rights of which before they were deprived, and are more and more taking the position of citizens with the same kinds of duties, privileges, and responsibilities as men. In part, also, it may be added, there is a growing diffusion among educated people of a knowledge of the primary facts of life in the two sexes, slowly dissipating and dissolving many foolish and often mischievous superstitions. The result is that, as many competent observers have noted, the young men of today show a new attitude towards women and towards marriage, an attitude of simplicity and frankness, a desire for mutual confidence, a readiness to discuss difficulties, an appeal to understand and to be understood. Such an attitude, which had hitherto been hard to attain at once, creates the atmosphere in which alone the free, spontaneous, erotic activities of women can breathe. This consummation, we have seen, may be regarded as the attainment of certain rights, the corollary of other rights in the social field, which women are slowly achieving as human beings on the same human level as men. It opens to women, on whom is always laid the chief burden of sex, the right to the joy and exaltation of sex, to the uplifting of the soul, which, when the right conditions are fulfilled, is the outcome of the intimate approach and union of two human beings. Yet, while we may find convenient so to formulate it, we need to remember that that is only a fashion of speech, for there are no rights in nature. If we take a broader sweep, what we may choose to call an erotic right is simply the perfect poise of the conflicting forces of life, the rhythmic harmony in which generation is achieved with the highest degree of perfection, Compatible with the make of the world, it is our part to transform nature's large conception into our own smaller organic mold, not otherwise than the plants to whom we are far back akin, who dig their flexible roots deep into the moist and fruitful earth, and so are able to lift up glorious heads toward the sky. Chapter 6. The play function of sex. When we hear the sexual functions spoken of, we commonly understand the performance of an act, which normally tends to the propagation of the race. When we see the question of sexual abstinence discussed, when the desirability of sexual gratification is asserted or denied, when the idea arises of the erotic rights and needs of woman, it is always the same act with its physical results that is chiefly in mind. Such a conception is quite adequate for practical working purposes in the social world. It enables us to deal with all our established human institutions in the sphere of sex, as the arbitrary assumptions of Euclid enable us to traverse the field of elementary geometry. But beyond these useful purposes, it is inadequate and even inexact. The functions of sex on the psychic and erotic side are of far greater extension than any act of procreation. They may even exclude it altogether. And when we are concerned with the welfare of the individual human being, we must enlarge our outlook and deepen our insight. There are we know two main functions in the sexual relationship, or what in the biological sense we term marriage among civilized human beings, the primary physiological function of begetting and bearing offspring, and the secondary spiritual function of furthering the higher mental and emotional processes. These are the main functions of the sexual impulse, and in order to understand any further object of the sexual relationship, or even in order to understand all that is involved in the secondary object of marriage, must go beyond conscious motives and consider the nature of the sexual impulse, physical and psychic, as rooted in the human organism. The human organism, as we know, is a machine on which excitations from without streaming through the nerves and brain affect internal work, and notably stimulate the glandular system. In recent years, the glandular system, and especially that of the ductless glands, has taken on an altogether new significance. These ductless glands, as we know, liberate into the blood what are termed hormones or chemical messengers, which have a complex but precise action in exciting and developing all those physical and psychic activities which make up a full life alike on the general side and the reproductive side, so that their balanced functions are essential to wholesome and complete existence in a rudimentary form. These functions may be traced back to our earliest ancestors, who possessed brains in those times. The predominant sense for arousing the internal mental and emotional faculties was that of smell, the other senses being gradually evolved subsequently. And it is significant that the pituitary, one of the chief ductless glands active in ourselves today, was developed out of the nervous center for smell. In conjunction with the membrane of the mouth, the energies of the whole organism were set in action through stimuli arising from the outside world by way of the sense of smell. In process of time, the mechanism has become immensely elaborated, yet its healthy activity is ultimately dependent on a rich and varied action and reaction with the external world. It is becoming recognized that the tendency to pluriglandular insufficiency, with its resulting lack of organic harmony and equilibrium, can be counteracted by the physical and psychic stimuli of intimate contacts with the external world. In this action and reaction, moreover, we cannot distinguish between sexual ends and general ends. The activities of the ductless glands and their hormones equally serve both ends in ways that cannot be distinguished. The individual metabolism, as a distinguished authority in this field has expressed it, is the reproductive metabolism. Thus, the establishment of our complete activities as human beings in the world is aided by, if not indeed ultimately dependent upon, a perpetual and manicided play with our environment. It is thus that we arrive at the importance of the play function, and thus also we realize that while it extends beyond the sexual sphere, it yet definitely includes that sphere. There are at least three different ways of understanding the biological function of play. There is the conception of play, on which Greuze has elaborately insisted, as education. The cat plays with the mouse, and is thereby educating itself in the skill necessary to catch mice. All our human games are a training in qualities that are required in life, and that is why in England we continue to attribute to the Duke of Wellington the saying that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. Then there is the conception of play as the utilization in art of the superfluous energies left unemployed in the practical work of life. this enlarging and harmonizing function of play while in the lower ranges, it may be spent trivially leads in the higher ranges to the production of the most magnificent human achievements. But there is yet a third conception of play, according to which it exerts a direct internal influence, a health-giving, developmental and balancing in the whole organism of the player himself. This conception is related to the other two, and yet distinct, for it is not primarily a definite education in specific kinds of life-conserving skill, although it may involve the acquisition of such skill, and it is not concerned with the construction of objective works of art, although by means of contact in human relationship it attains the wholesome organic effects, which may be indirectly achieved by artistic activities. It is in this sense that we are here concerned with what we may perhaps best call the play function of sex. As thus understood, the play function of sex is at once, in an inseparable way, both physical and psychic. It stimulates to wholesome activity all the complex and interrelated systems of the organism. At the same time, it satisfies the most profound emotional impulses, controlling in harmonious poise the various mental instincts along these lines. It necessarily tends in the end to go beyond its own sphere, and to embrace and introduce into the sphere of sex the other two more objective fields of play, that of play as education, and that of play as artistic creation. It may not be true, as was said of old time, most of our arts and sciences were invented for love's sake. But it is certainly true that in proportion as we truly and wisely exercise the play function of sex, we are at the same time training our personality on the erotic side and acquiring a mastery of the art of love. The longer I live, the more I realize the immense importance for the individual of the development, through the play function of erotic personality, and for human society of the acquirement of the art of love. At the same time, I am ever more astonished at the rarity of erotic personality, and the ignorance of the art of love even among those men and women experienced in the exercise of procreation, in whom we might most confidently expect to find such development and such art. At times one feels hopeless at the thought that civilization in this supremely intimate field of life has yet achieved so little for, until it is generally possible to acquire erotic personality, and to master the art of loving, the development of the individual man or woman is marred, the acquirement of human happiness and harmony remains impossible. In entering this field, indeed, we not only have to gain true knowledge, but to cast off false knowledge, and above all, to purify our hearts from superstitions, which have no connection with any kind of existing knowledge. We have to cease to regard as admirable the man who regards the accomplishment of the procreative act with the pleasurable relief it affords to himself as the whole code of love. We have to treat with contempt the woman who abjectly accepts the act, and her own passivity therein, as the whole duty of love. We have to understand that the art of love has nothing to do with vice, and the acquirement of erotic personality nothing to do with sensuality. But we have also to realize that the art of love is far from being the attainment of a refined and luxurious self-indulgence, and the acquirement of erotic personality of little worth, unless it fortifies and enlarges the whole personality in all its aspects. Now all this is difficult, and for some people even painful to root up, is a more serious matter than to sow. It cannot all be done in a day. It is not easy to form a clear picture of the erotic life of the average man in our society. To the best informed among us, knowledge in this field only comes slowly. Even when we have decided what may or may not be termed average, the sources of approach to this intimate sphere remain few and misleading at the best. The women a man loves remain far more illuminating sources of information than the man himself. The more one knows about him, however, the more one is convinced that, quite independently of the place we may feel inclined to afford to him in the scale of virtue, his conception of erotic personality, his ideas on the art of love, if they have any existence at all, are of a humble character. As to the notion of play in the sphere of sex, even if he makes blundering attempts to practice it, that is for him something quite low down, something to be ashamed of, and he would not dream of associating it with anything he has been taught to regard as belonging to the spiritual sphere. The conception of divine play is meaningless to him. His fundamental ideas, his cherished ideals in the erotic sphere, seem to be reducible to two. One, he wishes to prove that he is a man, and he experiences what seems to him the pride of virility in the successful attainment of that proof. Two, he finds in the same act the most satisfactory method of removing sexual tension, and in the ensuing relief one of the chief pleasures of life. It cannot be said that either of these ideals is absolutely unsound. Each is part of the truth. It is only as a complete statement of the truth that they become pathetically inadequate. It is to be noted that both of them are based solely on the physical act of sexual conjunction, and that they are both exclusively self-regarding, so that they are, after all, although the nearest approach to the erotic sphere he may be able to find, yet still not really erotic, for love is not primarily self-regarding. It is the intimate, harmonious, combined play. In the wide as well as in the more narrow sense, we are here concerned with two personalities. It would not be love if it were primarily self-regarding. And the act of intercourse, however essential to secure the propagation of the race, is only an incident, and not an essential in love. Let us turn to the average woman. Here the picture must usually be still more unsatisfactory, the man at least crude, as we may find his two fundamental notions to be, has at all events attained mental pride and physical satisfaction. The woman often attains neither, and since the man by instinct or tradition has maintained a self-regarding attitude, that is not surprising the husband be primitive instinct, partly certainly, by ancient tradition regards himself as the active partner in matters of love and his own pleasure, as legitimately the prime motive for activity. His wife consequently falls into the complementary position, and regards herself as the passive partner, and her pleasure as negligible, if not indeed as a thing to be rather ashamed of should she by chance experience it, so that while the husband is content with a mere simulacrum and pretense of the erotic life, the wife has often had none at all. Few people realize, few indeed have the knowledge or the opportunity to realize how much women thus lose alike in the means to fulfill their own lives, and in the power to help others. A woman has a husband, she has marital relationships, she has children, she has all the usual domestic troubles. It seems to the casual observer that she has everything that constitutes a fully developed matron fit to play her proper part in the home and in the world. Yet with all these experiences, which undoubtedly are an important part of life, she may yet remain on the emotional side and, as a matter of fact, frequently remains quite virginal, as immature as a schoolgirl. She has not acquired an erotic personality. She has not mastered the art of love, with the result that her whole nature remains ill-developed and unharmonized, and that she is incapable of bringing her personality, having, indeed, no achieved personality, to bring to bear effectively on the problems of society and the world around her. That alone is a great misfortune, all the more tragic, since under favorable conditions, which it should have been natural to attain it, might so easily be avoided. But there is this further result, full of the possibilities of domestic tragedy, that the wife so situated, however innocent, however virtuous, may, at any time, find her virginally sensitive emotional nature fertilized by the touch of some other man than her husband. It happens so often. A girl who has been carefully guarded in the home, preserved from evil companions, preserved also from what her friends regarded as the contamination of sexual knowledge, a girl of high ideals, yet healthy and robust, is married to a man of whom she probably has little more than a conventional knowledge, yet he may by good chance be the masculine counterpart of herself, well brought up without sexual experience, and ignorant of all but the elementary facts of sex, loyal and honorable, prepared to be fitted to be a devoted husband. The union seems to be of the happiest kind. No one detects that anything is lacking to this perfect marriage. In course of time, one or more children are born. But during all this time, the husband has never really made love to his wife. He has not even understood what courtship in the intimate sense means. Love as an art has no existence for him. He has loved his wife according to his imperfect knowledge, but he has never so much as realized that his knowledge was imperfect. She, on her side, loves her husband. She comes in time, indeed, to have a sort of tender maternal feeling for him. Possibly, she feels a little pleasure in intercourse with him, but she has never once been profoundly aroused, and she has never once been utterly satisfied. The deep fountains of her nature have never been unsealed. She has never been fertilized throughout her whole nature by their liberating influence. Her erotic personality has never been developed. Then something happens. Perhaps the husband is called away. It may have been to take part in the great war. The wife, whatever her tender solicitude for her absent partner, feels her solitude, and is drawn nearer to friends. Perhaps her husband's friends, some man among them, becomes congenial to her. There need be no conscious or overt lovemaking on either side. And if there were, the wife's loyalty might be aroused, and the friendship brought to an end. Lovemaking is not indeed necessary. The wife's latent erotic needs, while still remaining unconscious, have come nearer to the surface now that she has grown mature, and that they have been stimulated yet unsatisfied for so long. They have, unknown to herself, become insistent and sensitive to a sympathetic touch. The friends may indeed grow into lovers, and then some sort of solution by divorce or intrigue, scarcely, however a desirable kind of solution, becomes possible. But we are here taking the highest ground and assuming that honorable feeling, domestic affection, or a stern sense of moral duty renders such solution unacceptable. In due course the husband returns, and then to her utter dismay the wife discovers, if she has not discovered it before that during his absence, and for the first time in her life she has fallen in love, she loyally confesses the situation to her husband, for whom her affection and attachment remain the same as before. For what has happened to her is the coming of a totally new kind of love, and not any change in her old love. The situation which arises is one of torturing anxiety for all concerned, and it is not less so when all concerned are animated by noble and self-sacrificing impulses. The husband, in his devotion to his wife, may even be willing that her new impulses should be gratified. She, on her side, will not think of yielding to desires which seem both unfair to her husband and opposed to all her moral traditions. We are not here concerned to consider the most likely or the most desirable exit from this unfortunate situation. The points to note are that it is a situation which today actually occurs, that it causes acute unhappiness to at least two people who may be of the finest physical and intellectual type and the noblest character, and that it might be avoided if there were at the outset a proper understanding of the married state, and of the part which the art of love plays in married happiness and the development of personality. A woman may have been married once, she may have been married twice, she may have had children by both husbands, and yet it may not be until she is past the age of 30 and is united to a third man that she attains the development of erotic personality and all that it involves in the full flowering of her whole nature. Up to then, she had to all appearance had all the essential experiences of life, yet she had remained spiritually virginal, with conventionally prim ideas of life, narrow in her sympathies with the finest and noblest functions of her soul, helpless and bound at heart, unhappy even if not clearly realizing that she was unhappy. Now she has become another person. The new liberated forces from within have not only enabled her to become sensitive to the rich complexities of intimate personal relationship, they have enlarged and harmonized her realization of all relationships. Her new erotic experience has not only stimulated all her energies, but her new knowledge has quickened all her sympathies. She feels at the same time more mentally alert, and she finds that she is more alive than before to the influences of nature and of art. Moreover, as others observe, however they may explain it, a new beauty has come into her face, a new radiancy into her expression, a new force into all her activities. Such is the exquisite flowering of love, which some of us who may penetrate beneath the surface of life are now and then privileged to see. The sad part of it is that we see it so seldom, and then often so late. It must not be supposed that there is any direct or speedy way of introducing into life a wider and deeper conception of the erotic play function, and all that it means for the development of the individual, the enrichment of the marriage relationship, and the moral harmony of society. Such a supposition would merely be to vulgarize and to stultify the divine and elusive mystery. It is only slowly and indirectly that we can bring about the revolution which in this direction would renew life. We may prepare the way for it by undermining and destroying those degrading traditional conceptions which have persisted so long that they are instilled into us almost from birth, to work like a virus in the heart, and to become almost a disease of the soul. To make way for the true and beautiful revelation, we can at least seek to cast out those ancient growths which may once have been true and beautiful, but now are false and poisonous. By casting out from us the conception of love as vile and unclean, we shall purify the chambers of our hearts for the reception of love as something unspeakably holy. In this matter, we may learn a lesson from the psychoanalysts of today without any implication that psychoanalysis is necessarily a desirable or even possible way of attaining the revelation of love. The wiser psychoanalysts insist that the process of liberating the individual from outer and inner influences that repress or deform his energies and impulses is effected by removing the inhibitions on the free play of his nature. It is a process of education, in the true sense, not of the suppression of natural impulses, nor even of the installation of sound rules and maxims for their control, not of the pressing in, but of the leading out of the individual's special tendencies It removes inhibitions even, inhibitions that were placed upon the individual, or that he consciously or unconsciously placed upon himself with the best moral intentions, and by so doing it, allows a larger and freer and more natively spontaneous morality to come into play. It has this influence above all in the sphere of sex, where such inhibitions have been most powerfully laid on the native impulses, where the natural tendencies have been most surrounded by taboos and terrors, most tinged with artificial stains of impurity and degradation, derived from alien and antiquated traditions. Thus the therapeutical experience of the psychoanalysts reinforces the lessons we learn from physiology and psychology, and the intimate experiences of life. Lovers in their play-when, they have been liberated from the traditions which bound them to the trivial or the gross conception of play in love-air. Thus, moving amongst the highest human activities alike of the body and of the soul, they are passing to each other the sacramental chalice of that wine, which imparts the deepest joy, that men and women can know they are subtly weaving the invisible cords that bind husband and wife together more truly and more firmly than the priest of any church. And if in the endas, may or may not Bethy attain the climax of free and complete union, then their human play has become one with that divine play of creation, in which old poets fabled that out of the dust of the ground, and in his own image, some god of chaos once created man. Chapter 7. The Individual and the Race. The relation of the individual person to the species he belongs to is the most intimate of all relations. It is a relation which almost amounts to identity, yet it somehow seems so vague, so abstract as scarcely to concern us at all. It is only lately indeed that there has been formulated even so much as a science to discuss this relationship, and the duties which, when properly understood, it throws upon the individual. Even yet the word eugenics, the name of this science, and this art sometimes arouses a smile. It seems to stand for a modern fad which the superior person, or even the ordinary plebeian democrat, may pass by on the other side, with his nose raised towards the sky. Modern the science and art of eugenics certainly seem, though the term is ancient, and the Greeks of classic days as well as their successors today used the word eugenia for nobility or good birth. It was chosen by Francis Galton less than 50 years ago to express the effort of man to improve his own breed. But the thing the term stands for is in reality also far from modern. It is indeed ancient and may even be nearly as old as man himself, consciously or unconsciously, sometimes under pretexts that have disguised his motives even from himself. Man has always been attempting to improve his own quality, or at least to maintain it. When he slackens that effort, when he allows his attention to be too exclusively drawn to other ends, he suffers, he becomes decadent, he even tends to die out. Primitive eugenics had seldom anything to do with what we call birth control. One must not say that it never had even the mysterious mica operation of so primitive a race, as the Australians has been supposed to be a method of controlling conception, but the usual method even of people highly advanced in culture has been simpler. They preferred to see the newborn infant before deciding whether it was likely to prove a credit to its parents or to the human race generally, and if it seemed not up to the standard, they dealt with it accordingly. At one time, that was regarded as a cruel and even inhuman method. Today, when the most civilized nations of the world have devoted all their best energies to competitive slaughter, we may have learnt to view the matter differently if we can tolerate the wholesale murder and mutilation of the finest specimens of our race in the adult possession of all their aptitudes. We cannot easily find anything to disapprove in the merciful disposal of the poorest specimens before they have even attained conscious possession of their senses. But in any case, and whatever we may ourselves be pleased to think or not to think, it is certain that some of the most highly developed peoples of the world have practiced infanticide. It is equally certain that the practice has not proved destructive to the emotions of humanity and affection. Even some of the lowest human races, we commonly estimate them, while finding it necessary to put aside a certain proportion of their newborn infants, expend a degree of love and even indulgence on the children they bring up which is rarely found among so-called civilized nations. There is no need, however, to consider whether or not infanticide is humane. We are all agreed that it is altogether unnecessary, and that it is seldom that even that incipient form of infanticide called abortion, still so popular among us, need be resorted to. Our aim, no so far at all events, as mere ideals, goes not to destroy life, but to preserve it. We seek to improve the conditions of life, and to render unnecessary the premature death of any human creature that has once drawn breath. It is indeed just here that we find a certain clash between the modern view of life and the view of earlier civilizations. The ancients were less careful than we claim to be of the individual, but they were more careful of the race. They cultivated eugenics after their manner. Though it was a manner which we reprobate, we pride ourselves rightly or wrongly on our care for the individual during all the past century. We claim to have been strenuously working for an amelioration of the environment, which will make life healthier and pleasanter for the individual. But in the concentration of our attention on this altogether desirable end, which we are still far from having adequately attained, we have lost sight of that larger end, the well-being of the race, and the amelioration of life itself, not merely of the conditions of life. The most we hope is that somehow the improvement of the conditions of the individual will incidentally improve the stock. These are practical ideals, which have flourished for a century past, arose out of the great French Revolution, and were inspired by the maxim of that revolution, as formulated by Rousseau, that all men are born equal. That maxim was overthrown half a century ago. The great biological movement of science, initiated by Darwin, showed that it was untenable. All men are not born equal. Everyone agrees about that now, but nevertheless, the momentum of the earlier movement was so powerful that we still go on acting as though all men are and always will be born equal, and that we need not trouble ourselves about heredity, but only about the environment. The way out of this clash of ideal switch has compelled us to hope impossibilities from the environment, because we dreaded what seemed the only alternatives, as we know, furnished by birth control, an unqualified reliance on the environment, making it ever easier and easier for the feeblest and most effective to be born and survive, could only in the long run lead to the degeneration of the whole race. The knowledge of the practice of birth control gives us the mastery of all that the ancients gained by infanticide, while yet enabling us to cherish that ideal of the sacredness of human life, which we profess to honor so highly. The main difficulty is that it demands a degree of scientific precision which the ancients could not possess and might dispense with so long as they were able to decide the eugenic claims of the infant. By actual inspection, we have to be content to determine not what the infant is, but when it be likely to be, and that involves a knowledge of the laws of heredity, which we are only learning slowly to acquire. We may all in our humble ways help to increase that knowledge by giving it greater extension and more precision through the observations we are able to make on our own families. To such observations, Galton attached great importance and strove in various ways to further them. Detailed records, physical and mental, beginning from birth, are still far from being as common as is desirable, although it is obvious that they possess a permanent personal and family private interest. In addition to their more public scientific value, we do not need, and it would indeed be undesirable to emulate in human breeding the achievements of a Luther Burbank. We have no right to attempt to impose on any human creature an exaggerated and one-sided development, but it is not only our right, it is our duty, or rather one may say the natural impulse of every rational and humane person, to seek that only such children may be born as will be able to go through life with a reasonable prospect, that they will not be heavily handicapped by inborn defect or special liability to some incapacitating disease. What is called positive eugenics attempt, that is, to breed special qualities, may well be viewed with hesitation, but so-called negative eugenics effort to clear all inborn obstacles out of the path of the coming generation demands our heartiest sympathy and our best cooperation. For as Galton, the founder of modern eugenics, wrote towards the end of his life of this new science, its first object is to check the birth rate of the unfit instead of allowing them to come into being. Though doomed in large numbers to perish prematurely, we can seldom be absolutely sure what stocks should not propagate, and what two stocks should on no account be blended, but we can attain reasonable probability, and it is on such probabilities in every department of life that we are always called upon to act. It is often said, I have said it myself, that birth control, when practiced merely as a limitation of the family, scarcely suffices to further the eugenic progress of the race. If it is not deliberately directed towards the elimination of the worst stocks, or the worst possibilities in the blending of stocks, it may even tend to diminish the better stocks, since it is the better stocks that are least likely to propagate at random. This is true if other conditions remain equal. It is evident, however, that the other conditions will not remain equal, for no evidence has yet been brought forward to show that birth control, even when practiced without regard to eugenic considerations, doubtless the usual rule up to the presenthas, produced any degeneration of the race. On the contrary, the evidence seems to show that it has improved the race. The example of Holland is often brought forward as evidence in favor of such a tendency of birth control, since, in that country, the widespread practice of birth control has been accompanied by an increase in the health and stature of the people, as well as an increase in their numbers, to a remarkable degree. For the fall in the birth rate has been far more than compensated by the fall in the death rate. While it is said that the average height of the population has increased by 4 inches, it is indeed quite possible to see why. Although theoretically a random application of birth control cannot affect the germinal possibilities of a community in practice, it may improve the somatic conditions under which the germinal elements develop. There will probably be a longer interval between the births of the children, which has been demonstrated by Ewart and others to be an important factor not only in preserving the health of the mother, but in increasing the health and size of the child. The diminution in the number of the children renders it possible to bestow a greater amount of care on each child. Moreover, the better economic position of the father, due to the smaller number of individuals he has to support, makes it possible for the family to live under improved conditions. As regards nourishment, hygiene, and comfort, the observance of birth control is thus a far more effective lever for raising the state of the social environment and improving the conditions of breeding than is direct action on the part of the community in its collective capacity to attain the same end. For however energetic such collective action may be in striving to improve general social conditions by municipalizing or state-supporting public utilities, it can never adequately counterbalance the excessive burden and wasteful expenditure of force placed on a family by undue child production. It can only palliate them. When, however, we have found reason to believe that even if practiced without regard to eugenic considerations, birth control may yet act beneficially to promote good breeding, we begin to realize how great a power it may possess when consciously and deliberately directed towards that end. In eugenics, as already pointed out, there are 2 objects that may be aimed at: one called positive eugenics, that seeks to promote the increase of the best stocks amongst us; the other called negative eugenics, which seeks to promote the decrease of the worst stocks. Our knowledge is still too imperfect to enable us to pursue either of these objects with complete certainty. This is especially so as regards positive eugenics, and since it seems highly undesirable to attempt to breed human beings, as we do animals, for points when we are in the presence of what seem to us our finest human stocks, physically, morally, and intellectually, it is our wisest course just to leave them alone as much as we can. The best stocks will probably be also those best able to help themselves, and in so doing to help others. But that is obviously not so as regards the worst stocks. It is therefore fortunate that the aim here seems a little clearer. There are still many abnormal conditions of which we cannot say positively that they are injurious to the race, and that we should therefore seek to breed them out. But there are other conditions so obviously of evil import, alike to the subjects themselves and to their descendants, that we cannot have any reasonable doubt about them. There is, for instance, epilepsy, which is known to be transformed by heredity into various abnormalities dangerous alike to their possessors and to society. There are also the pronounced degrees of feeble-mindedness, which are definitely heritable, and not only condemn those who reveal them to a permanent inaptitude for full life, but constitute a subtle poison working through the social atmosphere in all directions and lowering the level of civilization in the community. Nowhere has this been so thoroughly studied and so clearly proved as in the United States. It is only necessary to mention Dr. Roman 100 B. Davenport of the Department of Experimental Evolution at Cold Spring Harbor, New York, who has carried on so much research in regard to the heredity of epilepsy and other inheritable abnormal conditions, and Dr. Goddard of Vineland, New Jersey, whose work has illustrated so fully the hereditary relationships of feeble-mindedness. The United States, moreover, has seen the development of the system of social fieldwork, which has rendered possible a more complete knowledge of family heredity than has ever before been possible on a large scale. It is along such lines as these that our knowledge of the eugenic conditions of life will grow adequate and precise enough to form an effective guide to social conduct. Nature, and a due attention to laws of heredity in life, will then rank in equal honor to our eyes with nurture, or that attention to the environmental conditions of life, which we already regard as so important a regard to nurture, has led us to spend the greatest care on the preservation, not only of the fit, but the unfit, while meantime it has wisely suggested to us the desirability of segregating, or even of sterilizing the unfit. But the study of nature leads us further, and as Galton said, eugenics rests on bringing no more individuals into the world than can be properly cared for, and these only of the best stocks. That is to say that the only instrument by which eugenics can be made practically effective in the modern world is birth control. It is not scientific research alone, nor even the wide popular diffusion of knowledge, that will suffice to bring eugenics and birth control singly, or in their due combination, into the course of our daily lives. They need to be embodied in our instinctive impulses. Galton considered that eugenics must become a factor of religion and be regarded as sacred and virile creed, while Ellen Key holds that the religions of the past must be superseded by a new religion, which will be the awakening of the whole of humanity to a consciousness of the holiness of generation. For my own part, I scarcely consider that either eugenics or birth control can be regarded as properly a part of religion, being of virtue and not of grace. They belong more naturally to the sphere of morals, but here they certainly need to go far deeper than the mere intelligence of the mind can take them. They cannot become guides to conduct until their injunctions have been printed on the fleshy tablets of our hearts. The demands of the race must speak from within us in the voice of conscience, which we disobey at our peril. When that happens with regard to ascertained laws of racial well-being, we may know that we are truly following, even though not in the letter, those great spirits like Galton with his intellectual vision, and Ellen Key with her inspired enthusiasm, who have pointed out new roads for the ennoblement of the race. Roman 2. It may be well, before we go further, to look a little more closely into the suspicion and dislike which eugenics still arouses in many worthy old-fashioned people. To some extent, that attitude is excused not only by the mistakes which in a new and complex science must inevitably be made even by painstaking students, but also by the rash and extravagant proposals of irresponsible and eccentric persons, claiming without warrant to speak in the name of eugenics 2,000 years ago. The wild excesses of some early Christians furnished an excuse for the ancient world to view Christianity with contempt, although the extreme absence of such excesses has furnished still better ground for the modern world to maintain the same view today. Such a work as Lahara's Humane, the Human Stud Farm of Dr. Bennett Sangle, putting forward proposals which, whether beneficial or not, will certainly find no one to carry them out, similarly furnishes an excuse to those who would reject eugenics altogether. Utopian schemes have their value. We should be able to find inspiration in the most modern of them, just as we still do in Plato's immortal Republic. But in this, as in other matters, we must exercise a little intelligence. We must not confuse the brilliant excursion of some solitary thinker with the well-grounded proposals of those who are concerned with the sober possibilities of actual life in our own time. People who are incapable of exercising a little shrewd common sense in the affairs of life, and are in the habit of emptying out the baby with the bath, had better avoid touching the delicate problems connected with practical eugenics. There is one prejudice already mentioned due to lack of clear thinking, which deserves more special consideration, because it is widespread among the socialistic democracy of several countries, as well as among social reformers, and is directed alike against eugenics and birth control. This prejudice is based on the ground that bad economic conditions and an unwholesome environment are the source of all social evils, and that a better distribution of wealth or a vast scheme of social welfare is the one thing necessary. When that is achieved, all other things being added unto us, without any further trouble on our part, it is certainly impossible to overrate the importance of the economic factor in society, or of a good environment. And it is true that eugenics alone, like birth control alone, can effect little if the economic basis of society is unsound. But it is equally certain that the economic factor can never in itself suffice for fine living, or even as a curial of social and racial diseases. Its value is not that it can effect these things, but that it furnishes the favorable conditions for effecting them. He would be foolish indeed who went to the rich to find the example of good breeding. And as is well known, it is not with the rich that the future of the race lies. The fact is that under any economic system, the responsible personal direction of the individual and the family remain equally necessary, and no progress is possible so long as the individual casts all responsibility away from himself onto the social group. He forms part of the social group, after all, is merely himself, and the likes of himself, he is merely shifting the burden from his individual self to his collective self, and in so doing he loses more than he gains. Thus there is always a sound core in that individualism, which has been preached so long and practiced so energetically, especially in English-speaking lands. However great the abuse involved in its excesses, it is still in the name of individualism that the most brilliant antagonists of eugenics and of birth control are wont to direct their attacks. The counsel of self-control and foresight in procreation, the restriction necessary to purify and raise the standard of the race, seem to the narrow and short-sighted advocates of a great principle an unwarrantable violation of the sacred rights of their individual liberty. They have not yet grasped the elementary fact that the rights of the individual are the rights of all individuals, and that individualism itself calls for a limitation of the freedom of the individual. That is why even the most uncompromising individualist must recognize an element of altruism, call it whatever name you will, collectivism, socialism, communism, or merely the vague and long-suffering term democracy. One cannot assume individualism for oneself unless one assumes it for the many. That is a great truth, which goes to the heart of the whole complex problem of eugenics and birth control. As Paracost has well argued, biology is altogether against the narrow individualism, which seeks to oppose collective individualism, for if in accordance with the most careful modern investigations, we recognize that heredity is supreme, that the qualities we have inherited from our ancestors count for more in our lives than anything we have acquired by our own personal efforts, then we have to admit that the capable man's wealth is more the community's property than his own. And similarly, the incapable man's poverty is more the community's concern than his own, so that neither the capable nor the incapable are entitled to an unqualified power of freedom, and neither likewise are justly liable to be burdened by an unqualified responsibility. It is the duty of the community to draw on the powers of the fit, and equally its duty to care for the unfit. In this way, Paracost, whose attitude is that of the rationalist, is led by science to a conclusion, which is that of the Christian. We are all members each of the other, and still more are we members of those who went before us. The generations preceding us have not died to themselves but live in us, and we whom they produced live in each other, and in those who will come after us. The problems of eugenics and of birth control affect us all. In the face of these problems, it is the voice of man that speaks, inasmuch as ye did it not unto the least of these, my brethren, ye did it not unto me. However firmly we base ourselves on the principles of individualism, we are inevitably brought to the fundamental facts of eugenics, which, if we fail to recognize our individualism, becomes of no effect. But it is the same with socialism, or by whatever name we chose to call the collectivist activities of the community in social reform. Socialism also brings us up against the hard rock of eugenic fact, which, if we neglect it, will dash our most beautiful social construction to fragments. It is the more necessary to point this out, since it is on the socialist and democratic side, much more frequently than on the individualist side, that we find an indifferent or positively hostile attitude towards eugenic considerations. Put social conditions on a sound basis. The people on this side often say, let all receive an adequate economic return for their work, and be recognized as having a claim for an adequate share in the products of society, and there is no need to worry about the race, or about the need for birth control. All will go well of itself. There is not the slightest ground for any such comfortable. This has been well shown by Dr. Eden Paul, himself a socialist, and even in sympathy with the extreme left, after setting forth the present conditions with our excessive elimination of higher types and undue multiplication of lower types, the racial degeneration caused by the faulty and anti-selective working of the marriage system in modern capitalist society, so that in our existing civilization unconscious natural selection has largely ceased to work towards the improvement of the human breed. He proceeds to consider the possible remedies. The frequent impatience of the socialist and social reformers, generally with eugenic proposals, has a certain degree of justification in the fact that many evils thoughtlessly attributed to inferiority of stock are really due to bad environment. But when the environment has been so far improved that all defects due to its badness are removed, we shall be face to face, without possibility of doubt, with bad inheritance as the sole remaining factor in the production of inefficient and antisocial members of the community. A socialist community must recognize the right to work and to maintenance of all its members, Eden Paul points out. But he adds, a community which allowed this right to all defectives, without imposing any restrictions in their perpetuation of themselves, would deserve all the evils that would fall upon it. It is quite clear how intolerable the burden of these evils would be a state that provided an adequate subsistence for all alike the inefficient, as well as the efficient would encourage a racial degeneration, from excessive multiplication of the unfit, far more dangerous, even than that of today ability to earn the minimum wage. Eden Paul argues in agreement with H.G. Wells, must be the condition of the right to become a parent, unless the socialist is a eugenist, as well the socialist state will speedily perish from racial degradation. Thus it is essential that the eugenist dealing with the hereditary factor of life, and the social reformer or socialist dealing with the environmental factor, should supplement each other's work. Neither can attain his end without the other's help, for the eugenist alone cannot overcome the environmental factor, even perhaps increases it if he is an individualist in the narrow sense, and the socialist alone cannot overcome the bad hereditary factor, and will even increase it if he is no more than a socialist. The more socialist our state becomes, the more essential becomes at the same time the adoption of eugenic practices as a working part of the state. Socialism and eugenics must go hand in hand. Paracost, from his own point of view, has independently reached the same conclusions. He is not indeed concerned with any socialist community of the future, but with the dangerous results which must inevitably follow the already established methods of social reform in our modern civilized states, unless they are speedily checked by effective action based on eugenic knowledge. If he observes the community is to shoulder half or three-quarters of the burden of sustaining those degenerates who, through no fault of their own, are congenitally incompetent to maintain themselves in decent comfort, and is to render the life pilgrimage of these unfortunates tolerable, instead of a dreary nightmare, if it is to assume paternal charge of all the tens or hundreds of thousands of children whose parents cannot or will not provide adequately for them, and is to guarantee to all such children as much education as they are capable of receiving and a really fair start in life. Then, in sheer self-preservation, the community must insist on and rigidly enforce its absolute claim to secure that no degeneracy or inheritable congenital defects shall persist beyond the present generation of degenerates, and that the community of 50 or 70 years hence shall have no incubus of mentally or morally or even physically degenerate members, none but a few occasional sporadic morbid sports from the normal, which it in turn may effectively prevent from handing on their like, unless the problem is squarely faced. Paracost concludes national deterioration must increase, and a permanently successful collectivist society is inherently impossible. We are not now concerned with the details of any policy of eugenics and of birth control which I couple together, because, although a random birth control by no means involves much if any eugenic progress, it is not easy under modern conditions to conceive any practical or effective policy of eugenics, except through the instrumentation of birth control. We here take it for granted that in this field the slow progress of scientific knowledge must be our guide. Premature legislation, rash and uninstructed action will not lead to progress, but are more likely to delay it. Yet even with imperfect knowledge, it is already of the first importance to evoke interest in the great issue here at stake, and to do all that we can to arouse the individual conscience of every man and woman to his or her personal responsibility in this matter that is here all taken for granted. It seems necessary to consider the political aspect of eugenics, because that aspect is frequently invoked, and a man's attitude towards this question is frequently determined beforehand by what he considers that individualism or socialism demands. We see that when the question is driven home, our political attitude makes no difference. It is only a shallow individualism, it is only a still more shallow socialism, which imagines that under modern social conditions, the fundamental racial questions can be left to answer themselves. Roman 3. Many years before the Great War, in all the most civilized countries of the world, there were those who raised the cry of race suicide in America. This cry was more especially popularized by the powerful voice of Theodore Roosevelt. But in European countries, there were similar voices raised in tones of virtuous indignation to denounce the same crime. Since the war, other voices have been raised in even more high-pitched and feverish tones, but now they are less weighty and responsible voices, since to those who realize that at present there is not food enough to keep the population of the world from starvation, it seems hardly compatible with sanity to advocate an increased rate of human production. Now, though it is easy to do so, we must not belittle this cry of race suicide. It is not usually accompanied by definite argument, but it assumes that birth control is the method of such suicide, and that the first and most immediately dangerous result is that one's own nation, whichever that may be, is placed in a position of alarming military inferiority to other nations as a step towards the final extinction. It is useless to deny that it really is a serious matter if there is danger of the speedy disappearance of the human race from the earth by its own voluntary and deliberate action, and that within a measurable period of time, for if it were an immeasurable period, there would be no occasion for any acute anxiety. Last man will perish from the world. This is what race suicide means, and we must face the fact squarely. It can scarcely be said, however, that the meaning of race suicide has actually been squarely faced by those who have most vehemently raised that cry. Translated into more definite and precise terms, this cry means, and is intended to mean, we want more births. That is what it definitely means, and sometimes in the minds of those who make this demand, it seems also to imply nothing more, yet it implies a great number of other things. It implies certain strain and probable ill health on the mothers. It implies distress and disorder in the family. It implies, even if the additional child survives, a more acute industrial struggle. And it further involves, in this case, by the stimulus it gives to overpopulation, the perpetual menace of militarism and war. What, however, even at the outset, more births most distinctly and most unquestionably imply is more deaths. It is nowadays so well known that a high birth rate is accompanied by a high death rate. Exceptions are too few to need attention that it is unnecessary to adduce further evidence. It is only the intoxicated enthusiasts of the race suicide cry who are able to overlook a fact of which they can hardly be ignorant. The model which they hold up for the public's inspiration has on the obverse more births, but on the reverse it bears more deaths. It would be helpful to the public, and might even be wholesome for our enthusiasts' own enlightenment, if they would occasionally turn the medal round and slightly vary the monotony of their propaganda by changing its form and crying out for more deaths. It is a hard thing, said Johnny Dunn, for a man that has a house full of children to be left to the mercy of Almighty God. If, however, we wish to consider the real significance of the facts, without regard for the wild cries of ignorant cranks, it is scarcely necessary to point out here that neither the birth rate taken by itself, nor the death rate taken by itself, will suffice to give us any measure even of the growth of the population, to say nothing of the progress of civilization or the happiness of humanity. It is obvious that we must consider both gains and losses, and put one against the other. If we wish to ascertain the net result, we may roughly get a notion of what that result is by deducting the death rate from the birth rate, and calling the remainder the survival rate. If we are really concerned with the question of the alleged suicide of the race, and do not wish to be befooled, we must pay little attention to the birth rate, for that by itself means nothing. We must concentrate on the survival rate. Then we may soon convince ourselves not only that the human race is not committing suicide, but that not even a single one of the so-called civilized nations of which it is mainly composed is committing suicide. Quite the contrary, every one of them, even France, where this peculiar suicide is supposed to be most actively at work, is yearly increasing in numbers. It is interesting to note, moreover, that the French have been increasing faster, that is to say, the survival rate has been higher in recent years, just before the war, when the birth rate was at its lowest, than they were 20 years earlier with a higher birth rate. And if we take a wider sweep and consider the growth of the French population towards the end of the 18th century, we find the birth rate estimated at the very high figure of 40. But the death rate was nearly as high. The average duration of life was only half what it is now, so that the survival rate in France at that time, with widely different rates of birth and death, was not much unlike. It is now the recent French birth rate of 19 and less, which automatically causes the race suicide marionette to dance with rage, is producing not far from the same result in growth of the population. We are not here concerned with the enormous difference in well-being and happinesses. The extremely high rate of 40, which sends our marionettes leaping to the sky with joy in wartime England in 1917, the birth rate sank to 17, yet the death rate was at 14, and the increase of the population continued. The more the human race commits this kind of suicide, one is tempted to exclaim, the faster it grows. It is, however, in the New World, as in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, that we find the most impressive evidence of the real criteria of the growth in population, set up for judgment on the racial suicide cranks, Canadian statistics bring out many points instructive, even in their variation. Here we see not only unusual curves of rise and fall, but also pronounced differences due to the special peculiarities of the French population, most clearly in the province of Quebec, but also in some parts of the province of Ontario in Quebec. The birth rate some years ago was 35, and the death rate 21, both rates high, and the survival rate high at 14. Recently, the birth rate has risen to 37, and the death rate fallen to 17, with the result that the survival rate of 20 is the highest in the world, though it must be noted that the high birth rate is not likely to last long, since in Quebec as elsewhere in the world increasing urbanization causes a decreasing birth rate in mainly English-speaking Ontario. The birth rate is much lower, about 24, but the death rate is also lower, about 14, so that the fairly considerable survival rate of 10 is obtained. But we note the highly significant fact that some 30 years or more ago the birth rate was much lower, about 19, and yet the survival rate was almost 9, nearly as high as today. The death rate was then at 10, and nothing could be more instructive as to the real relationship that holds in this matter. There has been a great rise in the birth rate, and the only result, as someone has remarked, is a great increase in the population of the graveyards. Equally instructive is it to compare various cities in the same province, living under the same laws and fairly similar social conditions. In the report of the Registrar General of Ontario for 1916, I find that highest in birth rate of cities in the province stands Ottawa with a very considerable French population, but first also stands the same city for infant mortality, which is 3 times greater than in some other cities in the province. With a low birth rate, Sault Ste. Marie, again, with an enormous birth rate, stands third for infant mortality. Canada shows us that even if we regard the crude desire for a large growth of population as reasonable, and that is a considerable assumption, a high birth rate is an uncertain prop to rest on. Canada is an instructive example because we have some ground for believing that the difference between the English-speaking and French-speaking populations, greater care of the former in procreation, and the more recklessly destructive methods of the latter in attaining the same end, due to their different attitudes towards the use of methods of birth control. What the result of a general use of such methods is, we know from the example already mentioned of Holland, where they are taught, officially recognized, and in general use not only among the rich, but among the poor. The result is that the birth rate has been falling slowly and steadily for 40 years, but the death rate has also been falling, and at a greater rate, so that the more the birth rate has fallen, the higher has been the rate of increase among the population. It is perhaps in Australia and New Zealand that we find the most satisfactory proofs of the benefits of a falling birth rate. In relation to race suicide, the evidence may well appeal to us the more since it is precisely here that the race suicide fanatic finds freest scope for his wrath. He looks gleefully at China with its prolific women, at Russia with its magnificent birth rate, before the war of nearly 50, at Romania with its birth rate of 42, at Chile and Jamaica with nearly 40. No nonsense about birth control, there no shirking by women of the sacred duties of perpetual maternity, no immoral notions about claims to happiness and desires for culture. And then he turns from those great centers of prosperity and civilization to Australia, to New Zealand, and his voice is choked, and tears fill his eyes as he sees the goal of race suicide nearly in sight, and the specter of the last man rising before him. For there is no doubt about it, Australia and New Zealand contain a population which is gradually reaching the highest point yet known of democratic organization and general social well-being, and the birth rate has been falling with terrific speed. 60 years ago in the Australian Commonwealth, it was nearly 44. Only 40 years ago in New Zealand, it was 42. Now, it is only about 26 in both lands, yet the survival rate, the actual growth of the population, is not so very much less with this low birth rate than it was with the high birth rate, for the death rate has also fallen in both lands to about 10 in New Zealand to 9, which is lower than any other country in the world. The result is that Australia and New Zealand, where, so it is claimed, preventives of conception are hawked from door to door, instead of being awful examples of race suicide, actually present the highest rate of race increase in the world, only excepting Canada, where it is less firmly and less healthily based, nearly twice that of Great Britain, and able at the present rate to double itself every 44 years. So much for race suicide. The outcry about race suicide is so far away from the real facts of life that it is not easy to take it seriously, however solemn one's natural temperament may be. We are concerned with people who arrogantly claim to direct the moral affairs of the world, even in the most intimately private matters, and who are yet ignorant of the most elementary facts of the world, unable to think, not even able to count. We can only greet them with a smile. But this question has nevertheless a genuinely serious aspect, and I should be sorry even to touch on the question of birth control in relation to race suicide without making that serious aspect clear. Race suicide, we know, has no existence. Not only is the race as a whole increasing in number, especially its white branches, but even among the separate national groups, there is not even one civilized people anywhere in the world that is decreasing in number. On the contrary, they are all, even France, increasing at a more or less rapid rate in England, and Wales, for example, where the birth rate has steadily fallen during the last 40 years from 36 to 23. I disregard the abnormal rates of wartime. The population is still increasing, and even if the present falls in birth rate and death rate continue, it will for years still go on increasing by an excess of over 1,000 births a day. When we realize that this is merely what goes on in one corner of the world, and must be multiplied enormously to represent the whole, we shall find it impossible even to conceive the prodigious flow of excess babies, which is being constantly poured over the earth. If we are capable of realizing all the problems which thereby arise, we must be forced to ask ourselves, is this state of things desirable? Be ye fruitful and multiply. That command was, according to the old story, delivered to a world inhabited by 8 people. It has been handed down to a world in which it has long been ridiculously out of place, and has become merely the excuse for criminal recklessness among a race which has chosen to forget that the command was qualified by a solemn admonition: at the hand of man, even at the hand of every man's brother, will I require the life of man. The high birth rate has meant a vast slaughter of infants. It has meant, moreover, a perpetual oppression of the workers, disease, starvation, and death among the adult population. It has meant further a bloodthirsty economic competition, militarism, warfare. It has meant that all civilization has from time to time become a thin crust over a volcano of revolution, and the human race has gone on lightly dancing there, striving to forget that ancient warning from a soul of things even deeper than the voice of Jehovah: at the hand of man will I require the life of man. Men have recklessly followed the will o' the wisp, which represented mere multiplication of their inefficient selves, as the ideal of progress, quantity before quality, the notion that in an orgy of universal procreation could consist the highest good of humanity. The great war that is scarcely yet merged into an only less warlike peace has brought at least the small compensation that it has led men to look in the face. This insane ideal of human progress, we see today what has come of it, and the further evils yet to come of it are being embodied beneath our eyes, so that at last the voice of Jehovah has here and there been faintly heard, even where nowadays we had grown least accustomed to hear it, in the churches. It is Dr. Ng, the Dean of London's Cathedral of St. Paul's, a distinguished churchman and at the same time a foremost champion of eugenics, who lately expressed the hope that the world, especially the European world, would one day realize the advantages of a stationary population. Such a recognition, such an aspiration, indicates that a new hope is dawning on the world's horizon, and a higher ideal growing within the human soul. The mad competition of the industrial world during the past century, with the sordid gloom and wretchedness of it, for all who were able to see beneath the surface, has shown forever what comes of the effort to produce a growing population by high birth rates in peacetime. The great war of a later day has shown, let us hope, in an equally decisive manner, what comes to a world where men have been for long generations produced so copiously and so cheaply that it is natural to regard them as only fit to sweep off the earth with machine guns, and the whole world of Tadiwith, its starving millions struggling in vain to feed themselves with most of its natural beauty, swept away by the ravages of man, and many of its most exquisite animals finally exterminate, is likely to become merely the monument to an ideal that failed. It was time, however late in the day, for a return to common sense. It was time to realize that the ideal of mere propagation could lead us nowhere but to destruction. On that level, we cannot compete even with the lowest of organized things, not even with the bacteria, which in number and in rapidity of multiplication are inconceivable to us. All hope abandon ye, that enter here is written over the portal of this path of progress. There are definite reasons why real progress in the supreme tasks of civilization can best be made by a more or less stationary population, whether the population is large or small. And it need scarcely be added that so far as the history of mankind is yet legible, the great advances in civilization have been made by small, even very small populations, where the population is rapidly growing even if it is growing under the favorable conditions that hardly ever accompany such growth. All its energy is absorbed in adjusting its perpetually shifting equilibrium. It cannot succeed in securing the right conditions of growth, because its growth is never ceasing to demand new conditions. The structure of its civilization never rises above the foundations, because these foundations have perpetually to be laid afresh, and there is never time to get further. It is a process, moreover, accompanied by unending friction and disorder, by strains and stresses of all kinds, which are fatal to any full harmonious and democratic civilization. The population question, with the endlessly mischievous readjustment it demands, must be eliminated before the great house of life can be built up on a strong, solid human foundation to lift its soaring pinnacles towards the skies. That is what many bitter experiences are beginning to teach us. In the future, we are likely to be much less concerned about race suicide, though we can never be too concerned about race murder. When we think, however, of the desirability of a more or less stationary population, in order to ensure real social progress as distinct from that vain struggle of meaningless movement to and fro, which the history of the past reveals, we have to be clear in our minds that it may be far from desirable that the present overgrown population of the world should be stationary. That might indeed be better than further increase in numbers. It would arrest the growth of our present evils. It might open the way to methods by which they would be diminished or eliminated, but the process would be infinitely difficult and almost infinitely slow, as we may easily realize when we consider that with a population even smaller than at present, the human race has not only ravished the world's beauty almost out of existence, but so ravaged its own vital spirit, that, as was found with some consternation during the Great War, a large proportion of the male population of every country is unfit for military service. So often we hear it assumed or even asserted that greatness means quantity, so that to look forward to the replacement of the present teeming insignificant human myriads by a rarer and more truly greater race is to be a pessimist. Oh, these optimists to revel in a world which more and more closely resembles all that the poets ever imagined of hell. Is to be an optimist. One wonders how it is that in no brief moment of lucidity it occurs to these people that the lower we descend in the scale of life, the greater the quantity in a species, and the poorer the quality, so that to reach what such people should really regard as the world's period of supreme greatness in life, we must go back to the days before animal life appeared, when the earth was merely a teeming mass of bacteria. To stem the devastating tide of human procreativeness, however easy as it may seem in theory, is by no means so easy as some think, especially as those think who believe that the human race stands on the brink of suicide. For there is this about it, that we must never forget the majority of those born today die before their time, so that by diminishing the production of the unfit, as well as by the progressive improvement of the environment that automatically accompanies such diminution, we may make an imposing difference in the appearance of the birth rate, whilst yet the population goes on increasing rapidly, probably even more rapidly than before. It needs a most radical and thorough attack on the birth rate before we can make any real impression on the rate of increase of the population. To say nothing of its real reduction, there is still an arduous road before us. True it is that we have two opposing schools of thought which both say that we need not, or that we cannot make any difference by our efforts to regulate the Earth's human population. According to one, view the development of population together with the necessity for war, which is inextricably mixed up with a developing population, cannot be effected without, as one champion of the doctrine is pleased to put it, shattering both the structure of Euclidean space and the psychological laws upon which the existence of self-consciousness and human society are conditional. In simpler words, populations tend to become too large for their territories, so that war ensues and birth control can do nothing, because it is doubtful whether a group in the plenitude of vigor and self-consciousness can deliberately stop its own growth. The other school proclaims human impotence on exactly opposite grounds. There is not the slightest reason, it declares, to believe that birth control has had any but a completely negligible influence on population. This is a natural process, and fertility is automatically adjusted to the death rate whenever a population reaches a certain stage of civilization and nervous development. Its procreativeness, quite apart from any effort of the will, tends to diminish. The seeming effect of birth control is illusory. It is nature, not human effort, which is at work. These two opposing counsels of despair, each proclaiming, though in a contrary sense, the vanity of human wishes in the matter of procreation, might well, some may think, be left to neutralize each other and evaporate in air. But it seems worth while to point out that with proper limitations and qualifications, there is an element of truth in each of them, while without such limitations and qualifications, both are alike obviously absurd and wrong-headed. Undoubtedly, as the one school holds in certain stages of civilization, even at a fairly advanced stage, nations tend to break out over their frontiers with resulting war. But the period when they reach the plenitude of vigor and self-consciousness is exactly the period when the birth rate begins to decline, and the population deliberately or instinctively controls its own increase. That has, for instance, been the history of France, since the great expansion of population roughly associated with the Napoleonic epoch, which doubtless covered a web of causes, sanitary, political, industrial, favorable to a real numerical increase of the nation, had died down slowly to the level we witness today. Similarly, with regard to the opposing school, we must undoubtedly accept a natural fall in the birth rate with a rising civilization that has always been visible in highly civilized individual couples, and it is an easily ascertainable zoological fact that throughout the evolution of life, procreativeness has decreased with the increased development of species. We may agree that a natural factor comes into the recent fall in the human birth rate, but to argue that because a natural decline in birth rate is the essential factor in the slowing down of procreative activity with all higher evolution, therefore deliberate birth control counts for nothing, since exactly the same result follows when voluntary prevention is adopted. And when it is not, seems highly absurd. We must at least admit that voluntary birth control is an important contributory cause, in some sense indeed of supreme importance, because it is within man's own power, and because man is thus enabled to guide and mold processes of nature which might otherwise work disastrously. How disastrously is shown by the history of Europe, and in a notable degree France, during the 4 or 5 centuries preceding the end of the 18th century, when various new influences began to operate. During all these centuries, there was undoubtedly a very high birth rate, yet infant mortality, war, famine, insanitation, contagious diseases of many and virulent kinds, tended as far as we can see to keep the population almost or quite stationary, and so ruinous a method of maintaining a stationary population necessarily used up most of the energy which might otherwise have been available for social progress, although the stationary population, even thus maintained, still placed France at the head of European civilization. The more firmly we believe that the diminution of the population is a natural process, the more strenuously surely we ought to guide it, so that it shall work without friction, and so far as possible tend to eliminate the undesirable stocks of man, and preserve the desirable. Clearly, the theory itself calls for much effort, since it is obvious that along natural lines the decline, if it is the result of high evolution, will affect the fit more easily than the unfit. Thus, there seems, on a wide survey of the matter, no reason whatever to quarrel with that conviction, which is gradually overspreading all classes of human society in all parts of the world, and ever more widely leading to practical action, that the welfare of the individual, the family, the community, and the race is bound up with the purposive and deliberate practice of birth control, whether we advocate that policy on the ground that we are thereby furthering nature, or on the opposite, and no doubt equally excellent ground, that we are thereby correcting nature. Along this road, as along any other road, we shall not reach utopia, and since the utopia of every person who possesses one is unique, that perhaps need not be regretted, we shall not even within any measurable period of time reach a sanely free and human life fit to satisfy quite moderate aspirations. The wise birth controller will not, like the deliciously absurd suffragette of old time, imagine that birth control for all means a new heaven and a new earth, but will rather appreciate the delightful irony of the biblical legend, which represented a world with only 4 people in it, yet one of them, a murderer. Still, it may be pointed out, that was a state of things much better than we can show now. The world would count itself happier if during the Great War only 25% of the population of belligerent lands had been murderers virtually, or in fact there is something to be gained, and that something is well worthwhile. Still, whether we like it or not, the task of speeding up the decrease of the human population becomes increasingly urgent to many of our undesirables. It may seem mere sentiment to trouble about the ravishing of the world's beauty or the ravaging of the world's humanity, but certain hard facts even today have to be faced. The process of mechanical invention continues every day on an ever-increasing scale of magnitude. Now that process, however necessary, however beneficial, involves some of the chief evils of our present phase of what we call civilization, partly because it has deteriorated the quality of all human products, and partly because it has enslaved mankind, and in so doing deteriorated also his quality. Now, we cannot abolish machinery, because machinery lies in the very essence of life, and we ourselves are machines. But as the largest part of history shows, there is no need whatever for man to become the slave of machinery, even for machinery to injure the quality of his own work. Rightly used, it may improve it. The greatest task before civilization at present is to make machines what they ought to be, the slaves, instead of the masters of men. And if civilization fails at the task, then without doubt it, and its makers will go down to a common destruction. It is a task inextricably bound up with the task of molding the human race, for which birth control is the elected instrument. Indeed, they are but two aspects of the same task. We have to accept the rugged fact that every step to render more nearly perfect the mechanical side of life correspondingly abolishes the need for men. Thus it is calculated today that whenever, in accordance with a growing tendency, coal is superseded by oil in industry, 2 men are enabled to do the work of 12. That is merely typical of what is taking place generally in our modern system of civilization. Everywhere a small number of men are being enabled to replace a large number of men. Not to avoid looking ahead, we may say that of every 12 millions of our population, 10 millions will be unwanted. Let them do something else, we cheerfully exclaim. But what no doubt there are always art and science infinite in their possibilities for joy and enlightenment, infinite also as we know in their possibilities of mischief and shallowness and boredom. Let it only be true science and great art. And 1 man is better than 10 millions to say, that is only to echo unconsciously the ancient saying of Heraclitus, 1 is 10,000 if he be the best. The vistas that are opened up when we realize the direction in which the human race is traveling may seem to be endless. And so, in a sense, they are. Man has replaced the gods he once dreamed of. He has found that he is himself a god, who, however realistic he seeks to make his philosophy, himself created the world as he sees it, and now has even acquired the power of creating himself, or rather of recreating himself, for he recognizes that at present he is rather a poor sort of god, so much an inferior god that he is hardly, if at all, to be distinguished from the lords of hell. The divine creative task of man extends into the future far beyond the present, and we cannot too often meditate on the words of the wisest and noblest forerunner of that future. The whole world still lies before us like a quarry before the master builder, who is only then worthy of the name, when out of this casual mass of natural material, he has embodied with all his best economy, adaptability to the end, and firmness the image which has arisen in his mind. Everything outside us is only the means for this constructing process. Yes, I would even dare to say also everything inside us deep within lies the creative force which is able to form what it will, and gives us no rest, until without us, or within us in one or the other way, we have finally given it representation. The future with all its possibilities is still a future infinitely far away, however well it may be to fix our eyes on the constellation towards which our solar system may seem to be moving across the sky. Meanwhile, every well-directed step, while it brings us but ever so little nearer to the far goal around which our dreams may play, is at once a beautiful process and an invigorating effort, and thereby becomes in itself a desirable end. It is the little things of life which give us most satisfaction, and the smallest things in our path that may seem most worthwhile.